Young millionaire hides in a cabin far from the world. He just wanted to escape everything. But a midnight knock on the door changes his destiny forever. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Stephen Reed stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his luxurious penthouse in Aspen, Colorado, a heavy sensation pressing against his chest. Evening lights sparkled below him, reflecting off the snow-laden streets, but he hardly noticed their brilliance. His gaze drifted, unfocused, as he clutched a photograph of his younger sister, Catherine. The picture showed her in a moment of genuine joy, hiking along a forest trail, her eyes brimming with life. That same warmth had vanished the day she died in a car accident. He hadn't taken her call beforehand. The memory of his phone buzzing in the middle of a high-stakes real estate meeting still haunted him. He inhaled sharply, recalling how he'd silenced his phone and brushed away the nagging thought of calling her back. He never did. Instead, he'd felt satisfied with the monumental deal he had closed, adding another triumph to his carefully curated collection of achievements. Now, whenever he looked at the city lights or the mirror-like surfaces in his penthouse, he felt only regret. Tossing the photograph onto a nearby coffee table, Stephen ran a hand through his dark brown hair. At 35, he had ascended to the top of the real estate world with calculated ease, forging a reputation as an impeccable closer. His eyes, a sharp, deep green, once radiated confidence. Now, they carried the weight of guilt and a sense of hollowness. The recent funeral service for Catherine had exposed a gulf between him and the rest of his family. They blamed him, in part, for not being there when she needed him. He blamed himself even more. His phone chimed, startling him from his thoughts. It was Peter Cohen, his longtime friend and business partner. Stephen glanced at the screen, debating whether to answer. Peter had tried to be supportive since Catherine's passing, but Stephen felt unready to face any conversation about the latest corporate deals or the state of his mental health. Finally, he pressed the accept button. "Stephen," Peter said softly, "I know it's late, but I wanted to check on you." Stephen cleared his throat. "I'm here, just trying to deal with some things." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken concerns. Peter's voice returned with a slight tremor of compassion. "Look, the board is worried. You haven't been in meetings. You're letting calls go unanswered. Everyone understands you're grieving, but they're getting anxious." Stephen gripped the edge of the table. "I appreciate your concern, but I can't keep going as if nothing happened. I need time." Peter hesitated. "I found a letter on your desk, something about cabins up in the mountains. Are you really planning to leave right now?" Stephen glanced at the folded letter from David Garrison, an old family friend who owned a series of rustic mountain retreats. It invited him to stay in a secluded cabin, away from prying eyes and corporate demands. He couldn't remember the last time he felt drawn to anything, but the idea of escaping to the quiet of the mountainside beckoned him. "Peter," he finally said, voice subdued, I can't focus on work or on anything, really. I need to figure out how to live with what I've done, or failed to do." After a brief pause, Peter replied, "All right, I'll do my best to keep things steady here. Just don't shut everyone out completely, okay?" Stephen hung up, feeling numb. He walked across the polished marble floor, passing the modern furniture he had once taken pride in. Every detail of his penthouse displayed his success. Stainless steel appliances, sleek leather couches, and a set of black and white prints that showcased the skyline of Aspen. Yet it all felt hollow now. His reflection on a glass cabinet revealed a man taller than average, shoulders taut with tension. He stared at himself for a moment, remembering Catherine's laughter. She'd always teased him about living in a tower of glass, too far removed from anything real. The heartbreak of losing her had intensified that accusation, making him question his entire way of life. The letter from David Garrison remained where he'd set it earlier. Stephen unfolded it once more, reading the straightforward invitation to stay in a cabin nestled deep in the mountains. David had mentioned the area was quiet, the perfect place to find solace. Stephen traced the signature at the bottom, recalling David's kindness from years past. He had introduced Catherine to birdwatching, ironically sparking her love for nature. Shaking off the memory, Stephen folded the letter again and set it aside. Walking back to the window, he gazed out into the winter night of Aspen. The city's glow stretched below him, a sea of light. He felt a twinge of dread at the thought of leaving comfort behind. But perhaps in the solitude of the mountains, he could confront his guilt, away from the phone calls and negotiations that once drove him. If he stayed in this penthouse, he feared he'd drown in regrets, hearing Catherine's last voicemail over and over. He locked the photograph of Catherine inside a small wooden box, then began methodically packing a duffel bag. Even as the methodical side of him listed the essentials he'd need for the mountains, another part of him trembled at the uncertainty. With a final glance around his penthouse, an empire of polished surfaces that reflected his ambition, Stephen found his heart set on the silence, waiting beyond the city's edge. He couldn't bring Catherine back, but maybe he could learn to live with the ghost of her memory, buried in the hush of the Colorado wilderness. Stephen woke up early to the soft glow of dawn filtering through the tall windows. The city below was quiet, heavy with the recent snowfall. He spent a moment sipping black coffee, tasting its bitterness as he scrolled half-heartedly through new messages. His phone's notifications were a jumble of unread work emails and half a dozen missed calls from clients. Each beep felt like a reminder of obligations piling up. He shoved the phone aside and turned his attention to the letter from David Garrison on the kitchen counter. He couldn't ignore the sense that this cabin might be a chance for him to find a fragment of peace. His reflection on the stainless steel fridge door looked grim, as if the life had been drained from his eyes. The small scar near his eyebrow, earned from a childhood bike accident, was barely visible now. Yet he remembered Catherine's panicked tears when he'd come home that day, bleeding. Her image lingered, fueling his urgency to leave. A new beep sounded. This time it was Peter again. Stephen exhaled slowly before answering. "I'm still here," he said. "Hey," Peter started. "The brokerage meeting is in an hour. Are you planning to show up?" Stephen pressed a hand to his forehead. "No, I told you. I'm leaving the city." Peter paused for a long time. "All right," he said eventually, with resignation in his tone. "We can postpone, but the investors won't wait forever, Stephen. If you need to do this, do it, but you have to be prepared for the fallout." He ended the call without promising anything. Conflict churned within him, a mix of guilt for abandoning his responsibilities and a determination that if he didn't escape now, he'd be consumed by regrets. He finished his coffee, placed the mug in the sink, and headed to his bedroom. Large windows showcased the breathtaking mountain range beyond Aspen, a sobering reminder of nature's quiet power. By mid-morning, he was on the road. The black SUV he rented cut through the snowy streets, leaving the tall buildings behind. He noticed how the vibrant ski shops and cafes seemed overshadowed by his own sense of loss. Memories of Catherine flickered in every passing pine tree or billboard touting winter sports. She had loved Aspen in winter, calling it the gateway to nature's real show. He recalled how she used to encourage him to slow down, to savor moments. He rarely listened. Now, guilt tugged at him with each mile he drove. 40 minutes later, the cityscape yielded to winding roads flanked by fir trees, their branches laden with snow. The sunlight peeked through the canopy, casting shifting patterns on the ground. As Stephen navigated a turn, the road seemed to narrow, the civilized hum of aspen replaced by the hush of the wilderness. The silence felt heavier than he expected. He pulled up to a small wooden lodge at the side of the road where David Garrison was supposed to meet him. Outside, an older truck was parked, and a figure in a thick coat waved. It was David, wearing a warm smile under a bushy grey beard. His eyes crinkled kindly at the corners, a hint of nostalgia in his expression. "Stephen," David greeted, voice resonant with familiarity. "It's been too long." Stephen forced a smile and stepped out into the cold. "It has. Thank you for letting me stay at one of your cabins." David clapped him gently on the shoulder, guiding him toward the lodge's front porch, where the wind was calmer. "I'm just sorry it's under these circumstances. I heard about Catherine. She was a wonderful soul." Hearing her name, Stephen nodded, feeling his throat tighten. Yes, she was. Inside the lodge, a modest fireplace crackled. David pulled out a set of keys attached to a wooden fob. "You'll have plenty of privacy. The place is a few miles up the mountain. I'd recommend stocking up on groceries here in town before you head up. There's a generator, but power can be spotty. We're expecting some heavier snow in the next few days." Stephen's eyes wandered around the lodge. Animal trophies and photographs of scenic vistas adorned the walls. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of pine logs. "I appreciate your hospitality." David handed over a folded map. "Follow this route. The cabin's remote, so don't rely on phone navigation. If you need anything, use the radio inside to call me. Cell service gets iffy up there." Stephen nodded, accepting the keys. A wave of relief and anxiety washed over him. He recognized that once he set foot in the cabin, it would just be him and his thoughts. No office calls, no market analyses, and no ignoring the voice in his head that replayed Catherine's last voicemail. But that was what he was here for, to face it. David gave him a thoughtful look. "Sometimes we need to leave our busy lives behind to see what truly matters, Stephen." Stephen felt the weight of those words and managed a faint smile. He thanked David again, then stepped back outside. The wind nipped at his cheeks, and he could see the sun creeping behind the mountains. Soon, everything would be dark, and he had an uneasy sense that he was heading into a deeper darkness within himself. Still, he braced himself for what lay ahead, determined to find some way to live with his regret, even if it meant facing the cold of his own loneliness in that distant, snow-blanketed cabin. Stephen followed David's hand-drawn map through a winding two-lane road that climbed steadily. The SUV's tires crunched over snow-packed gravel, while towering pines on each side created a shadowy tunnel. As he drove, occasional flashes of Catherine's face flooded his thoughts, triggering pangs of guilt. He wondered how different things could have been if he had just picked up that phone call. Would she still be alive? He gripped the steering wheel tighter, forcing his mind to concentrate on the present. The air outside was pristine, and every so often he glimpsed a deer darting between the trees. Icy patches made the drive precarious, but he pressed on, guided by a strange mixture of determination and dread. 20 minutes later, the road opened into a small clearing where he saw a rustic wooden cabin perched on a gentle slope. Shutting off the engine, he stepped outside. He was immediately struck by the profound stillness. No distant city hum, no murmurs of conversation, only the faint rustle of wind through branches. He scanned the cabin's exterior, a modest structure of dark wood with a pitched roof blanketed in snow. Smoke trickled from a small chimney, suggesting David had come up earlier to warm the place. Dragging his duffel bag through the snow, Stephen reached the porch. The old planks creaked under his boots. He paused to examine the thick logs that formed the walls, each one bearing the marks of time and weather. A small part of him admired the craftsmanship. though the heavier part of him wondered if he could really handle this kind of isolation. He found the door unlocked, as David had promised. Inside, the warmth hit him like a gentle embrace. A crackling fireplace in the corner cast a dancing glow over a simple living area. There was a worn leather armchair, a small kitchenette, and a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs. The walls, made of exposed logs, gave the space a cozy yet stark feel, as if it stood outside the normal flow of time. Exhaling, Stephen set his bag down and removed his gloves. The fireplace's flickering light revealed dust particles floating in the air. He walked around the room, inspecting the framed pictures on a shelf, photographs of mountain vistas and local wildlife. Probably David's snapshots, he thought. He soon noticed the radio equipment David had mentioned, an old shortwave radio on a small desk, with an antenna leaning against the wall. A stack of instructions lay beside it. Stephen ran a finger over the radio's dials, suddenly aware of just how cut off he would be if it failed. Realizing he was on the brink of second-guessing his decision, he inhaled deeply, trying to ground himself in the reason he came here, to confront the ghosts of his past, not to run from them. He explored the rest of the cabin, finding a small bedroom with a single bed and an oil lamp. A tattered quilt was folded neatly at the foot of the mattress. The bathroom was no bigger than a closet, with a simple sink and a stand-up shower. Everything was minimal, but functional. He suddenly missed the stainless steel appliances of his penthouse, though the memory of that place now felt suffocating. Back in the living area, Stephen sat on the edge of the armchair. Shadows flickered across the floor, reminding him of how many nights he'd spent in darkness lately, replaying Catherine's last voicemail in his mind. He hesitated before pulling out his phone from his coat pocket. The signal bars flickered, then vanished. He glanced at the device, half relieved, half anxious. No endless stream of business calls or texts, no unstoppable wave of guilt-tripping from family, just silence. With a resigned sigh, he placed the phone on the table and picked up a small family photo he'd brought, one taken years ago during a rare vacation. Catherine stood beside him, beaming, their parents behind them. The memory of that day returned. The 2 of them had rented bikes to explore the countryside, Catherine joking about how clumsy he was on uneven terrain. It was the day he got the scar near his eyebrow. She'd been so worried about him then, so quick to laugh and scold him at the same time. A sudden wave of emotion tightened his chest. He closed his eyes, pressing the photo to his heart. In the hush of the cabin, each breath sounded amplified. He wished he could talk to Catherine, to apologize, to do anything that might rewrite the final chapter of her life. But he knew he couldn't. The thought consumed him like a grief-stricken anchor pulling him under. Slowly opening his eyes, he set the photograph down and rose to his feet. The fire crackled, a small comfort in an otherwise unforgiving place. He realized he was hungry but couldn't muster much enthusiasm to cook. Still, he rummaged through the supplies he'd picked up, pulling out bread and some canned soup. As he heated the soup on the tiny stove, he felt a pang of loneliness. In the past, Catherine's chatter would have filled the space, or at least a business call would have kept him preoccupied. After a sparse meal, he stood by the window, gazing at the gathering darkness outside. The dense pines looked like silent sentinels, guarding the secrets of this land. The night sky unfurled a blanket of stars, far more vivid than any view he had from his penthouse. It should have been beautiful, but all Stephen could think about was the impending confrontation with his own regrets. Morning arrived without ceremony. Stephen stirred from a restless sleep to find the cabin eerily quiet. A pale sunlight filtered through the windows, illuminating floating specks of dust. He shivered, realizing the fire had burned down to embers in the night. Wrapping himself in a thick sweater, he added fresh logs to the fireplace and coaxed the flames back to life, the warmth offering a temporary solace against the chilly mountain air. He made coffee on the small stove, breathing in the earthy aroma as he watched the steam swirl in the cabin's soft light. His thoughts drifted to the day of Catherine's accident. The memory played in slow motion. He'd been in a conference room, signing documents worth millions. His phone had rung, vibrating on the polished table, but he'd merely glanced at it, too focused on his ambition. Later, that single act of neglect proved irreversible. He sipped his coffee, wrestling with the knowledge that nothing would change the outcome. A series of muffled thuds pulled him from his thoughts. Someone was outside, trudging through the snow. Heart pounding, he set down his mug and moved to the window. A figure in a parka with fur trim was making her way toward the front porch. Opening the door warily, he saw a woman with chestnut-brown hair tied back, though a few strands escaped around her face. She looked to be in her 30s, her cheeks were flushed from the cold, and she carried a small toolbox. A polite smile curved her lips. "Morning," she said, lowering the hood of her parka. "You must be Stephen Reed. I'm Janet, David's daughter. Dad asked me to check if the generator's giving you any trouble." A cautious relief washed over him. "Yes, David mentioned you might drop by. I haven't touched the generator yet. I appreciate the help." Janet shook her head gently as she stepped inside, stomping snow off her boots. "It's part of the deal. These cabins can be finicky. A storm's rolling in, so we want to make sure everything's in working order." She headed around to the back of the cabin. Stephen followed, noting how she glanced at him with a mixture of curiosity and mild concern. The generator, a rusty contraption, stood beneath a makeshift awning. Janet knelt beside it, inspecting wires and connections. He hovered uncertainly, wishing he had something more to say. "How are you finding it up here?" she asked, her tone friendly. Not everyone adjusts well to the quiet. Stephen inhaled, considering a polite answer. "It's different," he said. "I came here to get away from the city, needed some space." Janet reached into her toolbox. "I don't blame you. After my mum passed, Dad and I found solace in these mountains. Sometimes stepping away from the bustle is the only way to hear yourself think." He stiffened at the reminder of loss. "Yeah, I lost my sister recently," he confessed. "I keep wondering if the quiet might bring some clarity, or if it'll just swallow me whole." She paused in her work, turning to give him a compassionate nod. "I'm sorry. Grief can be overwhelming, especially when you feel you could have done more. But trust me, there's healing in solitude if you let it happen." An uneasy silence followed. Stephen cleared his throat. "Thank you for saying that. I guess I'm not sure what I'm looking for." Janet turned back to the generator, tightening a loose bolt. "Well, for what it's worth, these mountains have a way of showing you who you are. That can be scary, but it can also be what you need." With a few final adjustments, she started the generator. A satisfying hum filled the air. She stood wiping her hands on a rag and gestured toward the cabin's rear window, which framed a tranquil view of snow-laden evergreens. "There's a beauty in this place that reminds me there's more to life than regrets." He gazed at the vista, the pristine white landscape almost too bright for his eyes. "I hope so," he murmured. Janet nodded thoughtfully. "If you need anything, radio Dad or me. The instructions are on the desk. The storm could get intense, so stock up on firewood and be prepared. You'll be all right." She gathered her toolbox and offered a warm smile. Before heading back into the cold, she paused, looking like she wanted to say something more, but decided against it. Then she disappeared through the swirling flurries. Left alone once again, Stephen walked back inside, the generator's hum now a steady reassurance in the background. He tugged off his gloves and tossed them on the table, absorbing Janet's words. Could he really face himself out here and find any form of absolution, or was he simply delaying the inevitable? The day crept along, the sky gradually turning a steely grey. Stephen worked in near silence, chopping extra firewood behind the cabin. Each swing of the axe brought fleeting relief, a tangible effort that momentarily eclipsed his haunting recollections. When the task was done, his arms ached, but there was a small, satisfying sense of accomplishment. He had done something purely physical, unlinked to the labyrinth of guilt in his mind. As the afternoon wore on, the wind picked up. By evening, the temperature dropped further. Even inside, with the fire roaring, he felt a chill that no blanket could fully dispel. He prepared a simple meal, mostly just to keep his hands busy. Eating felt like another mechanical activity, a routine necessity rather than a pleasure. Outside, the swirling snow formed ghostly shapes in the fading light. In that isolating darkness, he questioned whether he had the resolve to endure the raw confrontation with his past. Still, the heavy silence of the mountain pressed on him, insisting he either break or bend to its will. Night descended like a thick curtain. Stephen lit an old oil lamp for additional light. Shadows flickered across the cabin walls, reminding him of fleeting memories he couldn't quite grasp. The wind howled outside, pushing snow against the window panes. He sensed the storm's arrival, the gusts growing stronger with each passing hour. He moved to the table, where a single wooden chair faced the window. The storm's fury outside contrasted with the relative stillness inside. Part of him longed to get in his SUV and drive back to Aspen's familiar glow, but another part understood that leaving now would be giving in to fear. Confronting his guilt required staying the course, even if it was deeply uncomfortable. He forced himself to open a small journal he'd bought on impulse. Its pages were blank, inviting him to pour out the thoughts swirling in his head. He hesitated, then began scribbling, struggling to put his turmoil into words. The pen glided over the paper, writing halting sentences about Catherine, about the phone call he had ignored, about the funeral he had barely endured. Each line felt raw, as though he were peeling back layers of armor he'd carefully built over the years. Pausing, he stared at the curling edges of the lamp's flame. The cabin groaned under a particularly fierce gust of wind. He set the pen down, feeling emotionally drained but strangely relieved. He folded the journal closed, deciding he would continue this exercise in self-reflection when he had the strength. After a while, he set logs on the dwindling fire, the embers glowing an angry red before bursting into renewed flames. The nights here lasted longer, or so it seemed. The darkness felt deeper, the hours more drawn out, giving him ample time to ruminate on the choices that led him here. He wondered about Peter, if he was managing the business side of things, and whether the investors were losing patience. The money and deals that once fueled his ambition now seemed trivial, overshadowed by the guilt he couldn't shake. He prepared for bed, but sleep proved elusive. Uncertain, he rose and paced the room. The hush of the cabin pressed in, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the relentless wind. Every so often, a branch would snap outside, causing him to pause and listen carefully. He told himself that it was just the storm, that this was normal for mountainous areas in winter. Eventually, exhaustion settled over him. He extinguished the oil lamp, leaving only the faint light of the fire. Slipping under the thick quilt, he waited for sleep to come. Instead, memories intruded. He saw Catherine's face again, her warm smile, the way she teased him for being too serious. A tear escaped the corner of his eye, but he didn't wipe it away. He just let it trail down, losing itself somewhere on the pillow. The hours crawled by, yet somehow he managed to doze off in the quiet gloom. When he woke at dawn, the storm had abated, groggy and still emotionally raw. He pulled on his coat and stepped onto the porch. A glimmer of early morning light revealed a world blanketed in fresh snow. Everything sparkled in the pale sun. He tested the steps, carefully descending to the ground. The snow was deep, crunching under his boots. Surveying the cabin's surroundings, he realized he was standing in a kind of pristine wonderland, albeit one still tinged with his inner turmoil. The beauty of it was undeniable, and for a brief moment he felt a small sense of awe break through his grief. Making his way around the cabin, he checked that the generator was still running. He also looked at the tree line, noticing how quiet the forest seemed beneath the weight of all that snow. He thought of Janet's words about how these mountains could force a person to confront who they truly were. A sense of indecision gnawed at him. He wondered if he'd made the right choice to isolate himself in such a harsh environment, especially when his guilt was so intense. Would burying himself in solitude actually help him process Catherine's death, or would it push him further into despair? He trudged through the drifts, collecting fallen branches for extra firewood. The physical exertion offered a momentary distraction from the swirl of questions in his mind. Returning to the porch, he paused, inhaling the crisp mountain air. He placed the branches near the door, then stepped inside. The abrupt warmth enveloped him, reminding him that the cabin was his only shelter from the biting cold. He couldn't dismiss how symbolic that felt. This place was both a refuge and a prison, depending on how he chose to face the emotions haunting him. He set about restocking the fireplace, determined to keep the cabin warm. The day stretched before him, a blank slate like the journal pages. He realized that if he didn't push forward now, the heaviness inside might become too much. Yet a flicker of resolve stirred within him. He recognized, however faintly, that confronting his guilt was an ongoing journey, and though he still wavered about whether he could endure it, something in him whispered that this was the only path left to take. A light flurry of snow drifted across the cabin's front porch when Stephen cracked open the door at mid-morning. The chill air rushed in, and he saw David Garrison's familiar silhouette approaching. David wore a heavy coat, his bearded face rosy in the cold. A certain calmness radiated from the man, as if he carried within him a wellspring of hard-earned wisdom. Stephen felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. "Mind if I come in?" David asked, tapping his boots against the step to shake off the snow. Stephen stepped aside. "Of course. I was just about to make some coffee." Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth. David set his hat on a wooden peg by the door and glanced around, noting the scattered supplies, the half-folded blankets, and the open journal on the table. He seemed to understand, without Stephen having to say a word, that these were the traces of a restless spirit. "I've been meaning to check on you," David said. "That storm last night was fierce, but it's only the first of several we might see this winter. You managing all right?" Stephen nodded, avoiding direct eye contact. "I'm getting by. It's quieter than I expected." He realized how inadequate that sounded. The silence wasn't just an absence of noise, it was also a mirror, forcing him to see what he'd rather ignore. David took a seat near the fireplace, settling into a creaky wooden chair. "Sometimes, quiet is exactly what we need to hear what's really going on inside, hard as that can be." His tone wasn't pushy or judgmental. It felt more like an invitation to open up if Stephen wanted. Unsure how to respond, Stephen busied himself with the coffee. He scooped grounds into a small metal pot, poured water, and let it heat on the stove. The hiss and sputter filled the cabin, a welcome distraction from his tangled emotions. Eventually, he turned back to find David calmly watching him. "I came here to deal with things," Stephen said quietly. "To be honest, I don't know if I'm handling it well." He could still feel the pang of guilt under every word. David folded his arms across his chest, his expression thoughtful. "I knew Catherine," he said. "Not well, but enough to see she was kind-hearted. She had that spark of curiosity, always asking questions about the trails, the birds, everything." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm sure you miss her." Stephen's throat tightened. He lowered his gaze, remembering Catherine's bright grin. He found it difficult to speak, so he just nodded. The coffee began to bubble, and he seized the moment to remove it from the stove. Pouring 2 cups, he handed one to David, then sat in the opposite chair. David blew on the steaming cup, his gaze gentle. Grief is a hard teacher, especially when regret's in the mix. Stephen's grip on his mug tightened. "I feel like I failed her," he admitted. "All those big deals, phone calls I prioritized, and in the end, the one call that actually mattered, I ignored. If I'd answered, maybe I could have helped her somehow." David took a measured sip, letting the warmth spread. "You can't know that. Sometimes these things happen no matter what, but I get it. Losing someone under those circumstances can overshadow everything else." His voice was low, resonant with empathy. "I've made my share of mistakes, spent years trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. Eventually, I realized that we have to come to terms with our own limits." Stephen swallowed the lump in his throat. He wanted to believe that healing was possible, but the weight of Catherine's absence felt unending. The walls of the cabin seemed to close in on him when he dwelled on it for too long. David set his cup aside. "Your sister was a bright light," he said. "What would she want for you now? To punish yourself forever?" His question hung in the air, direct but compassionate. Stephen stared into his coffee. "No," he whispered. "I know she wouldn't, but it's hard to just move on." "Moving on doesn't mean forgetting," David replied, gently. "It means honoring her life and finding a path forward, one step at a time." Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the fireplace. Stephen took another sip, letting the moment sink in. Maybe David was right. Punishing himself wouldn't bring Catherine back. A thread of gratitude wound through his thoughts. Without pressuring, David had nudged him to see that there might be a different way to live with grief. Outside, the wind rattled a window pane. David stood, glancing at the dim sky beyond. "Storm clouds gathering again," he noted. "I'll be heading back soon, but I wanted to bring you something." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small pamphlet. "There's a memorial group in Aspen. They meet once a month. Some folks there have found it helps." Stephen accepted the pamphlet, feeling a touch of hope at the simple gesture. "Thank you," he said, his voice subdued but earnest. David offered a warm nod. "You're not alone in this, Stephen. Keep the radio close if you need anything." He put his hat back on, then paused at the door. "If the power goes out, that generator should hold, but don't hesitate to call. Sometimes the biggest hurdle is remembering we can reach out." Stephen managed a faint smile, a small release of tension in his chest. He walked David to the porch and watched as he trudged back to his truck. The swirling flakes enveloped David's figure until he was just a moving blur against the white landscape. Then he was gone, leaving Stephen with his thoughts and a feeling that, somehow, he'd just received a vital spark of reassurance in a place he never expected to find it. A biting wind blew through the narrow gap in the cabin door as Stephen secured the latch. The weather had worsened, thick gusts driving snow against the cabin walls. He dropped another log onto the fireplace, watching the sparks fly. In the muted glow, he glanced at the pamphlet David had given him. A memorial group in Aspen. The idea both intrigued and frightened him. He cleared his throat, restless, and pulled his cell phone from his pocket. As usual, there was barely any signal, but a single bar flickered on the screen. With some effort, He managed to dial Peter Cohen's number, each ring echoing in the hush. "Stephen," came Peter's voice, faint with static. "Is that you?" Stephen closed his eyes, fighting the urge to hang up. "Yeah, it's me." "Look, things are getting tense here," Peter said. "The investors want to know if you're still committed. You've missed deadlines, and some major decisions can't wait forever." Outside, the wind howled. Stephen could almost see the swirl of snow burying his old life. "I know," he replied, bracing himself, "but I need more time." "I'm not coming back right now," Peter exhaled. "This is bigger than just you, Stephen. We've got projects in progress, contracts pending. If you don't step in soon, the board might vote to remove you as acting director." A flicker of bitterness rose in Stephen's chest. "They can remove me if they want. I can't focus on real estate deals right now. Don't you understand?" Silence stretched across the connection. Finally, Peter's voice returned, tinged with resignation. "I do, but there's only so much I can do on my end. I'm stalling, but I won't be able to hold off the board for long." Stephen swallowed a surge of guilt. He pictured the office tower in Aspen, the neon reflection on the conference table where he'd once basked in success. Now it felt like a distant world. "Thanks for trying. Tell them whatever you have to. I'm staying here." Peter started to reply, but the static grew louder. Then the call dropped entirely, leaving Stephen in a void of silence. He stared at the phone, heart pounding, strangely liberated and terrified at the same time. By letting go of his role at the company, he was stepping across a line he'd always thought unbreakable. The identity he'd cultivated, Stephen Reed, unstoppable real estate mogul, was slipping away. He set the phone on the table and paced the small living area. He felt as if he'd just cut a tether, sending himself adrift in these mountains. For the first time in his adult life, he had no pressing meetings, no deals to close, no deadlines. The only task he faced was wrestling with his own grief and regret. He lit an oil lamp and grabbed the journal again. Tremors of anxiety fluttered in his stomach, but he forced himself to write about the conference room where he'd ignored Catherine's call. Each sentence emerged raw, describing the polished table, the pen's flick of ink, the triumphant handshake. He paused, knuckles whitening around the pen. Writing the memory forced him to relive the moment. The knot in his throat tightened, but he persisted, filling page after page with the details he had repressed. Outside, snow smacked the windows as if demanding entry. Stephen's lungs constricted. He closed the journal abruptly, tears welling in his eyes. He hadn't cried at Catherine's funeral. He'd been too numb. Now tears brimmed, a mix of anger and mourning. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel, to accept that he wasn't the unshakable man he'd pretended to be. Shuddering, he wiped his cheeks and stood to toss another log on the fire. The cabin hissed with the wind's fury, yet within the swirl of ice and wind, he sensed a clarity forming. He'd made a choice. Cut ties with the life that revolved around money and deals. If the board removed him, so be it. Perhaps the fear of losing everything was just a reflection of how worthless it all felt, without Catherine around. He sat on the armchair, letting the firelight warm his face. His mind drifted to David's pamphlet, and the possibility of returning to Aspen for a memorial group. The idea of standing among strangers, sharing his grief, seemed daunting, but maybe it was the next step. He couldn't hide forever in this cabin. The very thought unsettled him. He wanted isolation and dreaded it at the same time. Tired of wrestling with indecision, he rose and peered out the window. The snowy darkness made it impossible to see much beyond the nearest trees. Everything else dissolved into the storm, reminiscent of how his former life was blurring into memory. That old world wasn't truly gone, but it felt irreversibly distant. Returning to the flickering fire, he tried to recall something Catherine once said about fear. Fear's just a sign we still have something to protect. He remembered her words when she'd convinced him to go skydiving on a whim one summer. Back then, she'd teased him for clinging to safe routines. Now, ironically, there were no routines left, only the question of how to keep going despite regret. He settled onto the floor by the hearth, letting the warmth soothe him as the cabin lights flickered in the gale. The ties he'd severed weighed on him, yet amid that burden, there was a sliver of relief. Deep inside, he realized he was crossing a threshold, leaving behind the person he had been. The thought filled him with trepidation and a hesitant, tremulous hope. Morning broke through a veil of grey clouds, revealing a landscape blanketed in new snow. Stephen stepped out onto the porch, feeling the cold sting on his cheeks. He needed to break the cycle of pacing the cabin all day and decided to explore the forest. The notion felt both liberating and daunting. He grabbed his coat, boots, and a scarf, then checked the generator out back. It chugged along, though the fuel level was something he'd have to monitor. Satisfied, he trudged through knee-deep powder, each step sinking with a soft crunch. The air was fresh, sharper than he ever remembered breathing. The forest loomed ahead, towering pines draped in white. He moved carefully, following what appeared to be a narrow trail. Snow-laden branches drooped overhead, occasionally shedding clumps of snow onto his shoulders. He brushed them off, chuckling grimly at his inexperience. Catherine would have reveled in this. She'd have pointed out tracks in the snow or glimpses of wildlife. As he entered the thicker part of the woods, the wind seemed to hush. A silence enveloped him, different from the unsettling quiet inside the cabin. Here, it felt almost alive, humming with nature's hidden currents. He paused to admire a group of icicles clinging to a rocky overhang, their crystal forms catching the muted sunlight. For a moment, he felt a flicker of awe, a spark of the wonder Catherine often spoke about. Deeper into the forest, the trail faded, forcing him to navigate by intuition. He pressed on, determined to clear his head. Twigs snapped underfoot, and every few steps he'd hear the distant croak of a raven or the flutter of wings. Eventually, he paused at the base of a tall pine, leaning against its trunk to catch his breath. The physical exertion felt good, a grounding reminder that he was alive in spite of his grief. A rustling sound made him tense. He turned to see a lone deer emerge from behind a thicket, its dark eyes fixed on him. They watched each other for a hushed moment. Stephen felt oddly comforted by the deer's presence, as if nature itself acknowledged him. Then the animal bounded away, disappearing into the endless white and green. Pressing on, he reached a small clearing where the ground dipped into a narrow stream. Ice clung to the banks, the water quietly gurgling underneath. He picked his way across the shallow area, boots slipping on the slick rocks. Once on the other side, he found a fallen log and perched on it, listening to the gentle rush of water. Minutes passed as he soaked in the stillness, letting his mind wander. Memories of Catherine sprang up unbidden, a trip to a national park, her unstoppable laughter when they got lost on a hiking trail. He'd been so irritated then, checking his phone for a signal to call for directions, while she insisted they simply trust the forest. It dawned on him how often he'd wasted precious moments by being distracted, always chasing success or efficiency. His hands trembled slightly, whether from the cold or emotion, he couldn't tell. He wondered if he'd ever be able to forgive himself. Maybe that was what the mountains demanded of him, to face the fact that he couldn't undo the past, but he could decide how it would shape him moving forward. The question was whether he had the courage to do so. A stronger gust of wind swept through the clearing, coaxing Stephen to his feet. He noticed the sun's position. He'd been out longer than he realized. The temperature seemed to be dropping again, and he didn't want to be caught too far from the cabin if another storm rolled in. Gathering his resolve, he traced his way back, relying on footprints he'd left behind. The return journey felt different, more purposeful. Though the trail was the same, He sensed a quiet shift inside himself. Each step reminded him he was part of this vast landscape, neither above it nor separate from it. By the time he spotted the cabin's silhouette through the trees, a subtle warmth took root in his chest, recognition that he was learning to slow down, to notice life around him instead of rushing past it. Once on the porch, he stomped off the caked snow. The cabin door resisted the wind, groaning as he pushed it open. Inside, the fire had died down to embers, so he hastened to revive it. He shrugged off his coat and gloves, then paused by the window. The day's light was fading behind the peaks, painting them in a soft pink hue. Catherine would have photographed that sky without hesitation, capturing the delicate brushstrokes of color. He set a pot of water to boil, intending to make tea. His muscles ached from the hike, but it felt good, like a sign he'd done something real and tangible. Peering at his footprints, which were already beginning to vanish under drifting snow, he understood that nothing remained permanent out here. All could be covered, all could be wiped clean. Perhaps there was solace in that fact, a reminder that every day the world reshaped itself, and maybe, just maybe, he could reshape himself too. The storm arrived at dusk, a swirl of white that battered the cabin's walls. Stephen sat by the window, lamp burning low, watching the wind whip snow against the glass. He felt a cautious acceptance of this life now, a far cry from the electric hum of Aspen. Still, the howling gusts made the cabin groan, each creak and rattle setting him on edge. He tried to settle his nerves by organizing supplies. There was a systematic comfort in counting cans of soup, lining up water jugs, and folding spare blankets. The generator's dull hum served as a reminder that technology still stood between him and the raw forces of nature. He checked the fuel again, reassured to see it wasn't running low yet. After tidying, he flipped through a well-worn guidebook he'd found on a cabin shelf. It was filled with survival tips, identifying animal tracks, finding edible berries in spring, reading the cloud patterns for incoming weather. Though he had no pressing need to become a wilderness expert, the sense of learning something practical soothed his restless mind. When the storm raged harder, he turned on the shortwave radio. Static crackled through the speaker, and then, faintly, he picked up David's voice. "Stephen, do you copy? Over?" He grabbed the mic. "I'm here. It's coming down hard outside." "Stay put," came David's steady tone. "We've got reports this storm's blowing in from the north. Should pass by late morning. Power lines might go down, so keep an eye on that generator." Stephen exhaled, nodding to himself. "Understood. Thanks, David. Over." He set the radio aside. The knowledge that someone was within reach, albeit remotely, gave him a small sense of security. Yet he still felt the cabin sway in the wind, a stark reminder that nature held more power than any corporate boardroom he'd ever faced. Over the next hours, the storm intensified. The lights flickered once, twice, then held steady. He paced the floors, listening to the rattling windows. Memories surfaced of childhood thunderstorms that used to terrify him, and how Catherine would crawl into his room with a flashlight, telling him made-up stories until he fell asleep. The recollection brought a fleeting smile, followed by a pang of longing. Finally, near midnight, exhaustion won out. He crawled into bed and pulled the blankets tight. The wind still howled, but as he drifted off, his mind found a measure of calm in the routine tasks he'd done. In the morning, the cabin was silent again, embraced by a deep hush that signaled the storm had moved on. Stephen rose and lit the stove, heating water for a modest breakfast of instant oatmeal and tea. Then he bundled up and stepped outside to assess the damage. A thick new layer of snow coated everything, burying footprints, piling against the porch steps. Icicles hung like jagged teeth from the roof's edge. He sensed a deeper appreciation for just how vulnerable life here could be. how reliant he was on the simplest of resources. He went around the cabin, clearing snow from the windows and the area around the generator. Despite his rudimentary methods, he found a sense of calm in these chores. There was a rhythm to living here. Gather wood, keep the fire burning, maintain the generator, keep yourself nourished. It stripped away the complexities he was used to, like multiple business calls or racing from one meeting to another. He remembered how Catherine once joked, "You're so busy being successful, you've forgotten how to be alive." He brushed away a clump of snow from his coat, pausing at the memory. Maybe that was what she had tried to show him, that beneath ambition and achievement, there was a simpler, more authentic layer of living he'd neglected. A sudden wave of sadness filled him, but it wasn't the crippling guilt he'd felt before. It was more like mourning a lost opportunity to share this realization with his sister while she was still alive. With the path around the cabin cleared, he placed extra firewood inside. The sense of accomplishment from these basic tasks surprised him. He was no woodsman, but every day taught him something. Even the act of listening to the weather changed his perspective, making him feel part of the world instead of set apart from it. The midday sun peeked through low-hanging clouds, revealing a crystalline landscape. Rays glinted off the snow, and birds chirped tentatively from the pines. Stephen found himself smiling at their song. He realized that, while his grief remained, it no longer felt like an impenetrable wall. Moments of gratitude and wonder crept in, gentling the jagged edges of sorrow. He returned to the cabin, mind abuzz with small triumphs. Flipping open his journal, he jotted down a few lines about the storm and how it had tested him. Though he doubted he'd ever share these entries with anyone, it felt good to record his thoughts. It was a way of bearing witness to his own slow transformation, a quiet acceptance that life here demanded mindfulness. Sitting back, he closed his eyes and let the warmth of the fire wash over him. The storm had cleared, but the lessons remained. In the mountains, one either adapted or was swept away. There was a curious relief in letting go of his former pace, embracing the slower, more deliberate dance of survival and reflection in this hushed world of snow and solitude. Late in the afternoon, as Stephen prepared to chop more firewood, he heard the distant rumble of a pickup truck. Curiosity stirred within him. Few people ventured up these roads unless they had a reason. He hurried outside to see Janet Garrison pulling up. Her truck's engine sputtered before cutting out, leaving her in a swirl of kicked-up powder. She hopped down, cheeks pink from the chill. "Figured I'd check on you," she called, pushing her hood back. "Dad said the radio chatter mentioned you holding up fine, but I brought extra supplies just in case." Stephen offered a faint smile. "That's kind of you. Appreciate it." Janet moved around to the back of the truck, unloading a small crate of groceries. Milk, coffee, canned goods. She handed it to Stephen, who noted the weight with mild surprise. "David insists our guests don't starve in these storms," Janet said, smiling. "Also, we had an extra kerosene lamp. Thought you might find it useful." Stephen set the supplies on the porch. "Thank you. I've been making do with what I have, but it's good to have backups." Janet's gaze shifted to the newly piled snowdrifts around the cabin. "You've been out here a while now, huh? It's not exactly a vacation destination for most folks, but I guess you have your reasons." He stiffened slightly, uncertain how much he wanted to reveal. Yet he sensed Janet wasn't merely prying. She had an honest, open way about her. "I'm working through personal stuff. The solitude helps, or at least I'm hoping it will." Janet nodded with empathy. "Dad told me some about your sister. I'm sorry." Stephen drew a slow breath, feeling the familiar ache in his chest. "Thank you. It's been rough, but I'm managing." They stood there in awkward silence, the winter air pressing in. Then Janet cleared her throat. "Look, I'm no counselor, but I lost my mom when I was in college. Cancer took her quick, and Well, I ran away, traveled up and down the West Coast for months, trying to escape the grief. Didn't work. Eventually, I came back and helped Dad with these cabins. She paused, meeting Stephen's eyes. Being here reminds me that life has its seasons, and grief is just one of them. Stephen listened, feeling a glimmer of connection. I'm sorry for your loss, he said. And I appreciate you sharing that. Makes me feel a little less alone. Janet offered him a wry smile. We're all alone out here in some sense, but that doesn't mean we can't help each other. She glanced around. Need a hand with anything? Chainsawing, wood chopping, generator maintenance? He hesitated, then shrugged. I was about to chop more wood. I'd actually appreciate some pointers. My technique's probably terrible. Together, they walked behind the cabin, where a few freshly felled logs lay waiting. Janet showed him how to position the logs and handle the axe more efficiently. She took a couple of swings, demonstrating the right angle and force. Then Stephen tried, feeling a small thrill when the axe bit cleanly into the wood. This is a bit new to me, he admitted, panting slightly. But it's satisfying. Janet laughed. That's exactly how I felt when I moved back. City life never taught me this stuff, but it's kind of freeing, right? No corporate ladder to climb, just you and the log. He nodded, breath visible in the icy air. I was always chasing success, looking for the next deal, the next trophy. Guess that all seems pointless now. Janet's gaze softened. Doesn't have to be pointless. You can use what you've built in ways that actually matter. You're successful for a reason. Maybe you just need to see that success through a different lens. Stephen paused, leaning on the axe handle, thinking about her words. He remembered how Catherine used to talk about the importance of giving back, yet he'd been too wrapped up in his own drive to notice. A pang of regret surfaced, but he also felt a tinge of possibility. After they finished, both of them carried an armload of chopped wood back to the cabin's porch. Janet glanced at the horizon, where clouds gathered. The wind had shifted, hinting at another change in weather. I should probably head back soon, she said, resting her load of wood. Roads aren't great when it starts to get dark. But hey, if you need anything, let me or Dad know. We'll come if we can. Thanks, Stephen replied. I really mean it. You've been more help than you know. Janet gave him a gentle pat on the shoulder, then hopped into her truck. The engine sputtered again before roaring to life. Stephen watched the vehicle bump along the snowy path until it vanished between the tall pines. A sense of quiet enveloped him, but it didn't feel as heavy as before. He realized he'd just experienced genuine camaraderie for the first time since arriving. A small but significant bond formed in this wilderness. Returning inside, he put away the groceries. As he stowed the kerosene lamp in a safe spot, he noticed a faint glow in the western sky where the sun struggled to break through clouds. It struck him how even a little daylight could alter the entire mood of the landscape. Maybe, he mused, the same was true for people. Sometimes, all it took was a bit of warmth from someone else to dispel the most suffocating darkness. The following morning, thick clouds rolled in from the north, and an unsettling calm blanketed the mountain. Stephen caught the first flakes falling just after dawn. By midday, a full-fledged blizzard was underway, the strongest yet since he'd come to the cabin. Snow blew sideways, lashing the windows in icy sheets. Tending to the fire, Stephen tried to steady his nerves. He recalled David's warning that each storm here could be worse than the last. Yet he hadn't expected conditions to deteriorate this fast. The shortwave radio crackled with intermittent updates. David's voice came through with static, warning everyone in the area to stay indoors, especially those at higher elevations. The generator sputtered ominously around mid-afternoon, and Stephen's stomach churned with dread. Without power, he'd lose light, heat, and any means to contact help if things got worse. He pulled on his coat and ventured outside to check the unit. Blasting wind immediately whipped snow into his eyes, nearly blinding him. He crouched low, bracing himself against the gusts. Reaching the generator enclosure, he found the intake vent clogged with drifting snow. With numb fingers, he brushed the buildup away, hoping the machine would regain normal function. The generator sputtered again, coughed, then hummed back to life. Relief and cold sweat mingled inside him. He began to turn back toward the cabin, but a sudden gust knocked him sideways, nearly toppling him into a snowdrift. Gasping, he pushed himself upright, feeling snow creep down his collar. The cold bit his skin, driving home just how dangerous the situation was. If he lost his footing or got disoriented, he could freeze within minutes. Struggling through the drifts, he made his way back inside. He slammed the door shut and stood trembling for a moment, breath heaving in frosty puffs. The cabin's interior seemed dimmer, the daylight all but swallowed by the storm. He tried the light switch, still working, for now. His heart pounded as he considered the possibility of the generator failing again, or the fuel running low if this blizzard lasted longer than expected. He gathered flashlights, candles, and the kerosene lamp Janet had brought. Storing them on the table, he double-checked every corner of the cabin for potential drafts or leaks. As evening fell, the wind's howl intensified. The cabin groaned, beams creaking under the onslaught. Outside, the swirling snow rendered the windows opaque, like frosted glass. Fear gnawed at him, a primal concern that this place he'd chosen for isolation might become a trap. He recalled the guilt and grief that drove him here. Now a different urgency overtook those thoughts. Survival. Clutching the radio, he tried to hail David, but the static was thicker than before. Eventually, a crackling voice emerged. It was Janet. "Picking up, come in," she was saying, words broken by static. "Dad, can't get... You okay?" Stephen pressed the transmit button. "Janet, I'm here. The storm is bad. Generators struggling. Any tips?" Only static answered him at first. He tried again and again. Finally, Janet's voice flickered in. "Keep it clear. Vent." Then the static roared, and the signal was lost entirely. He set the radio down, frustration and fear pounding in his chest. The only thing he could do was what she'd advised. Keep the generator vent clear and ride this out. Grabbing his coat once more, he braced himself for another trip outside. Every hour or so, he repeated the process, clearing snow from the vent, listening to the engine, then retreating inside to warm up. By midnight, he felt exhausted and half-frozen. The thick shutters quivered under the furious wind. Without any sense of time beyond his watch and the cabin's dim light, he lost track of how often he'd made the trip. He dozed in the armchair, only to wake with a jolt whenever he heard the generator hiccup. Around 3 in the morning, the sputtering grew worse. Summoning the last of his stamina, he ventured out again. Snow whipped his face like shards of glass, cutting visibility to almost nothing. He inched forward, guided by the faint glow of the generator's small lamp. Clearing the vent took agonizing minutes. His fingers burned with cold despite his gloves. Finally, the machine churned steadily once more. He forced himself back along the cabin wall, taking each step carefully. Suddenly, a gust yanked him sideways, and he slid on ice, falling hard. Pain shot up his side, knocking the air from his lungs. Dizzy, he lay there, the snow piling over him. In a panic, he realized how easy it would be to lose consciousness in the bitter cold. With a desperate push, he rolled onto his knees, forcing himself up. He clung to the cabin's rough wooden exterior, inching around to the door. When he burst inside, the warmth hit him like an electric shock. Collapsing to his knees, he gasped for breath. It took several minutes before he could muster the strength to strip off his soaked coat and gloves. He lit the kerosene lamp, letting its glow illuminate the small space. The storm still roared outside, but at least the generator was functioning. Pain throbbed in his side, but it wasn't severe enough to stop him. Exhaustion weighed on his eyelids. Huddling by the fireplace, he realized that in this moment, all the guilt and ambition in the world meant nothing if he couldn't keep himself alive. A stark truth settled in. Here, stripped of everything, he faced the raw test of endurance. And though fear gripped him, he found a small ember of resolve. He'd endure this storm, no matter how brutal. In surviving, he sensed, lay the first real step toward forgiving himself. A lingering hush filled the cabin late that evening. The previous storms had finally subsided, leaving behind massive mounds of snow and a biting chill that seeped through every crack. Stephen Reed stood by the window, his thoughts drifting as he stared at the moonlit expanse. The moon, bright and cold, illuminated the still landscape, making the pines look almost spectral against the silver glow. He'd spent the day replenishing his firewood supply and tidying up, driven by a nervous energy he couldn't quite place. As the cabin walls closed around him, he felt an edgy restlessness. Perhaps it was the constant worry that another storm could strike without warning, or maybe it was the loneliness that had grown sharper in the silence. Shortly after midnight, as he dozed in the old armchair by the fire, a sudden, frantic knock pounded on the door. The sound jolted him awake. His heart hammered. Visitors at this hour were unheard of, especially given the snowdrifts that made the roads barely passable. He stood, uncertain, calling out, "Hello? Who's there?" Another series of knocks answered him, more urgent this time. Grabbing his coat, he edged toward the door and carefully unlatched it. A sharp gust of frosty air hit him. On the porch stood a woman, shivering violently, her blonde hair matted with snow. Her cheeks were flushed red from the cold, and her lips quivered. "Please," she rasped, voice trembling. "My car broke down. I don't know where else to go." Stephen instinctively stepped aside. "Come in." She stumbled over the threshold, nearly collapsing onto him. He caught her around the shoulders, feeling the ice-cold fabric of her coat. Shutting the door quickly, he guided her toward the fireplace. Her teeth chattered so hard, he feared she might lose consciousness from the cold. "Sit," he urged, dragging the footstool closer to the fire. "Let me get you something warm." Her eyes darted around in a panicked haze. The flickering light revealed her delicate features. She appeared to be around 30, with eyes a brilliant shade of blue that reminded him of alpine lakes in summer. Her clothes were soaked through, her boots caked with ice. He rushed to the kitchen area, filling a kettle with water for tea. The generator groaned softly, but held. Within moments, steam curled from the kettle's spout. While water heated, he fetched a thick wool blanket from the bedroom, draping it carefully around the stranger's shoulders. "Thank you," she managed between chattering teeth. I'm Olivia. Olivia Parker." "Stephen Reed," he replied in a rushed whisper. "Let's get you warmed up first. Then you can tell me what happened." As she huddled by the flames, color slowly returned to her face. He handed her a mug of hot tea, which she clutched in both hands. Her eyelids drooped with exhaustion, but she kept them open, clearly fighting off the threat of hypothermia. "My car slid off the road a few miles from here," she explained after a few sips, voice still trembling. "Engine died. I've been walking for over an hour." Her gaze drifted around the cabin, taking in the rustic surroundings. "Didn't think I'd find anyone out here. Saw a light through the trees." He nodded, heart racing as he imagined her desperate trek through the bitter cold. "You're lucky you saw the cabin. Another hour out there. Who knows? Are you hurt?" She shook her head, pressing the mug closer to her lips. "Just frozen. And exhausted." The tension in Stephen's chest began to ease, replaced by a guarded relief. He helped her remove her soaked coat and boots, fetching some spare socks and a sweater that were far too large but would help her warm up faster. She thanked him quietly, her voice faint. As he cleared space near the fire, he found himself struggling to reconcile this sudden intrusion with the careful solitude he'd built around himself. A practical side of him wanted to be sure she was stable, no broken bones or frostbite. Another part of him, the cautious part, warned not to get too close, yet her vulnerability stirred his empathy in a way he hadn't felt for a long time. "Sorry, I know it's not exactly homey here," he said, gesturing at the sparse interior. She offered a small, grateful smile. "It's more than I could have hoped for tonight." After a few more minutes of thawing out, Olivia's shaking subsided. She exhaled, shoulders sagging in relief. "Thank you for saving me," she murmured. "I don't want to trouble you, but there was nowhere else." Stephen sat on the nearby chair, feeling the warmth of the fire mingle with a twinge of concern. "You're not troubling me. The roads are treacherous. We'll figure out your car tomorrow, or whenever it's safe to travel." Silence filled the cabin, interrupted only by the crackle of flames. He could hear her measured breathing, sense the faint tension in the air, the tension of two strangers thrust together by circumstance. His chest tightened as he recalled all the times he'd shut people out, certain he didn't need anyone. Yet here, in this remote refuge, he found himself caring about someone else's well-being more than he expected. Relief mingled with anxiety as he realized that this forced companionship might unravel the protective shell he'd crafted around his grief. For the moment, though, he focused on keeping her warm, alive and safe in the face of the cruel winter night. Olivia woke early the next morning, curling closer to the fireplace where she'd spent the night on the old couch. She stirred when she heard Stephen adding logs to the fire, the soft glow illuminating his focused expression. He noticed her stirring and nodded in greeting, a touch of concern etched on his features. "How are you feeling?" he asked, straightening up. "Better," she replied, sitting up under the blanket, sore and a little lightheaded, but a lot warmer. She glanced around, taking in the cabin's modest living area in the daylight. The place felt cozy, if spare, filled with a quiet that was only broken by the crackling of flames. Stephen made a pot of coffee on the small stove. "You want some?" She nodded, though her eyes hinted at lingering exhaustion. While he poured 2 mugs, she looked at him more closely. He stood a few inches above average height, his dark hair a bit messy from sleep. Shadows under his eyes suggested he didn't rest much. "Thank you," she said when he handed her the steaming mug. They sat across from each other in near silence, sipping slowly. Though the tension of survival had passed, an awkwardness replaced it. 2 strangers bound by a harsh winter's whim, each seeming to carry unspoken burdens. "How did you end up out here?" Stephen finally asked, his tone gentle. She let out a dry laugh. "I came to Colorado to do a nature photography project. I was supposed to meet a friend in Aspen, but I got sidetracked chasing a storm shot. I misjudged the roads, and next thing I knew, my car spun off a patch of ice. The engine died, and there was no cell signal. Her voice caught for a moment. "I panicked, didn't see a single car pass by, and it was getting dark fast." Stephen exhaled, recalling his own panic in recent storms. "You did the right thing, heading for any light you could find." She studied his features, noticing the grave lines etched into his brow. "What about you, living out here alone?" He hesitated, gaze dropping to the floor. "I needed some space, time away. I've been here a while, just clearing my head." Olivia didn't push further. Instead, she took another sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle her nerves. After a few moments of introspective quiet, she pressed her palms to the mug. "I'm sorry for intruding, truly," she said, her voice soft. "You've been more than kind." Her genuine humility made him shift in his chair. "Don't apologize. I'm just glad you made it here safely." In the brightening morning light, he could see she was still pallid. "Are you sure you're all right?" She managed a small nod. "Tired?" "Mostly." "And I'm worried about my car, camera gear, everything," she trailed off, looking anxious. "Without a car, I'm stuck." Stephen glanced at the window, noting the unbroken expanse of snow. "No one's going anywhere until the roads clear some, but once they do, we can walk out, or I can try to drive you to Aspen in my SUV, if it's still passable." Her relief showed in a fleeting smile, though uncertainty lingered in her eyes. "I appreciate it." They fell silent again, both wrestling with private thoughts. Eventually, Olivia inquired about the cabin. "Is this your place or a rental?" He set his coffee down and shrugged. "I'm renting it from David Garrison, an old family friend. Came here after—" His voice faltered, words catching on the painful memory of Catherine. He swallowed and forced himself to continue. "After my sister passed away, I needed to think." A wave of sympathy crossed her face. "I'm sorry, that must be hard." He nodded. It is." They exchanged tentative looks, each recognizing a raw wound in the other. Olivia's curiosity was palpable, but she seemed to tread lightly, sensing Stephen's reluctance. Meanwhile, he felt a swirl of conflicting emotions. He'd come to these mountains to isolate himself from everyone, yet here he was, caring about the safety of a stranger who had stumbled into his life. The morning wore on, and Olivia mustered enough energy to join Stephen in checking the generator. She gasped when she stepped onto the porch, seeing how the storm had shaped towering drifts around the cabin. "No wonder I got lost," she remarked, staring wide-eyed at the whiteness that stretched in every direction. Stephen offered a faint nod. "This winter's been relentless. The roads might take days to clear properly." He hesitated, searching her face. "I don't mean to pry, but do you have anyone expecting you soon? Family, friends who might worry?" She bit her lip. "I have a friend in Aspen, but I didn't finalize my plans with him, and my parents are back in Seattle. I don't think they realize I'm stuck in a blizzard. Probably just assume I'm out taking pictures somewhere." She gave a shaky laugh. "I'm used to traveling alone, but this is a new level of isolation." Stephen motioned for her to stay close to the cabin's walls as they rounded to the generator. The cold wind stung their faces, cutting short any further conversation. Still, in the hush of the snowy wilderness, they both sensed that something unexpected was stirring. A connection formed under duress, each holding secrets too painful to fully share. Several days passed as the relentless snow kept the roads impassable. Inside the cabin, a fragile sense of routine emerged. Stephen gathered firewood each morning, sometimes with Olivia's help when she felt strong enough. She insisted on taking short walks, determined to keep herself active despite the cold. He warned her about hidden ice, but she persisted, armed with a camera whenever the sky cleared enough for a photograph. Their conversations grew more frequent, yet remained cautious. Over simple meals, canned soup, bread, and tea, they swapped stories in subdued voices. Olivia described her freelance photography work, capturing images of rare wildlife, chasing seasonal changes in forests and mountains, and always seeking a personal connection with nature's raw beauty. She recounted past journeys, from the deserts of Arizona to the coastlines of Maine, her eyes lighting up at each memory. Stephen listened, intrigued despite himself. His own experiences felt stark by comparison. Boardroom negotiations, fancy dinners with potential investors, and a tightly scheduled life in Aspen. He mentioned some business deals, though they seemed hollow in the face of Olivia's vivid travel recollections. He left out the deeper regrets that gnawed at him. One late afternoon, a soft lull in the weather allowed a pale sun to illuminate the landscape. Olivia found a spot near the cabin's edge, snapping pictures of the snow-laden pines. Stephen joined her, carefully stepping through the drifts. He watched her as she aimed her camera, waiting for just the right angle. "Never thought I'd see the beauty in all this white," he murmured, scanning the horizon. "I've been here for weeks, and most days I only see the storm." Olivia lowered her camera and turned to him, cheeks ruddy from the cold. "Sometimes you have to look for the small details, the way sunlight hits a branch, the shape of snow when it drifts off a tree. It's an exercise in noticing what's easy to miss." Her words struck him. He remembered Catherine's voice echoing something similar once, urging him to slow down. Before he could dwell on that memory, Olivia snapped a shot of a lone pine, weighed down by ice. She glanced at him, a curious spark in her eyes. "What brought you out here alone?" she asked gently, as if sensing his internal conflict. "I know you mentioned your sister, but is it just grief?" He felt a twinge of unease. The tension in his chest tightened. A swirl of wind brushed against them, rattling the branches overhead. "I'm dealing with regrets," he said at length, "and guilt. My sister died in an accident. I ignored her last phone call." The words tumbled out like a confession. "I was too busy. She needed me, and I failed her." Olivia listened quietly, her camera lowered. Empathy shadowed her features. "I'm sorry, that must be a heavy weight to carry." He exhaled, the cold air stinging his lungs. "It's been eating at me. I thought coming here would help me figure out how to live with it, or maybe just punish myself in solitude." She reached out, lightly squeezing his arm. "I can't pretend to know your pain, but I do know that guilt can trap us if we let it. Sometimes it helps to see the world through another lens, literally and figuratively." He offered a weary half-smile. "Yeah, maybe you can teach me to see what I've been missing." They walked back to the cabin, under a sky streaked with delicate pink and grey hues. Inside, they prepared a simple supper. Afterward, Olivia showed him some of her photographs stored on a camera card. She used his laptop. He apologized for the slow, offline setup, but she laughed it off, saying she'd used far worse conditions in remote jungles. They scrolled through breathtaking images: a moose crossing a frozen lake, a sunrise behind a cliff, and a close-up of an eagle in flight. Stephen felt a pang of envy for how freely Olivia seemed to embrace life, capturing each moment before it slipped away. Her voice grew animated as she described the circumstances behind each shot, from lying flat in the snow to trudging through swamps at dawn. At one point, she paused on a photograph showing a gravestone in a small rural cemetery at sunset. "I took this after losing someone close to me," she confessed, her voice faltering slightly. "A friend. It was my way of trying to make peace with the loss." Stephen nodded, feeling the rawness in her words. Loss was a language they both spoke, albeit in different dialects. For the remainder of the evening, they lingered near the fire, each lost in private thoughts. Every now and then, they locked eyes, acknowledging a fragile bond forming in this snowbound cabin. A bond that grew for both of them could be either a new beginning or an echo of past heartbreak. The days blended into one another, the snow outside forming a seamless blanket of white. Stephen and Olivia grew accustomed to each other's rhythms. She'd wake early, determined to venture out with her camera whenever weather permitted, while he maintained the cabin's infrastructure, checking the generator, chopping wood, and stoking the fire. Tucked away in this secluded world, their conversations slipped between light-hearted banter about coffee preferences and earnest confessions about their personal struggles. Olivia revealed her occasional fears that her passion for photography would never quite measure up to financial stability, or that she'd run out of meaningful subjects. Stephen opened up piece by piece about the emotional vacuum he'd lived in, how wealth and success had once been a shield to protect him from feeling too deeply. One afternoon, While a gentle snow fell outside, they found themselves seated on the floor by the fireplace, sorting through Olivia's camera gear. She was cleaning lenses and formatting memory cards. Stephen watched her with a quiet admiration. He saw her resilience in every gesture, how she took care of her tools, as though they were extensions of herself. "Tell me more about your life before all this," Olivia prompted, eyes flicking up from a lens cloth. "The boardrooms and big deals. I can't imagine that world." He leaned back, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "I started with almost nothing. Grew up in a small town, worked my way into real estate, flipping small properties, then caught a big break in Aspen. I built connections, took risks, made a fortune." A half sigh escaped him. "I loved it at first, like winning a game. But after a while, it became consuming. Catherine used to call me, say I was missing out on real life. Guess she was right." Olivia brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "Success isn't a bad thing. But I get how it can become everything if you're not careful." She studied his face for a moment. "Do you think you can find a balance now?" He considered the question, thoughts drifting to the guilt over Catherine's missed call. "I want to, but I'm not sure how I'll step back into that life. Part of me doesn't even want to go back. Another part feels obligated to do something meaningful with what I have." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Maybe this cabin is your turning point, a place to see things differently." He reached for a piece of firewood, tossing it into the flames. Sparks flew, reminding him of how fragile warmth could be in the midst of winter. "What about you?" he asked, turning the focus on her. "You said you lost a friend." She sighed, reflexively clutching her camera. "My friend Anna, we traveled a lot together. She died in a rafting accident in Oregon. I was supposed to be there, but I backed out last minute for a job assignment. I thought I had all the time in the world to make it up to her." Her voice wavered. "It's not the same as what you went through with Catherine, but I get the regret." He gently rested a hand on her shoulder. "It sounds like we both let ourselves get carried away by obligations, only to lose someone we cared about. Maybe that's why we connect now." Shared guilt. She blinked back tears, managing a faint, tremulous smile. "Maybe so, but also shared hope that we can find a path forward." A hush filled the cabin. Outside, the snowfall tapered to light flurries. Stephen's heart pounded with an awareness that he was allowing himself to feel close to someone again, something he'd resisted ever since Catherine's death. He wanted to protect himself from more pain, yet here he was, caring about Olivia's well-being, her hopes, her grief. He stood, offering her a hand up. "Come on, let's step outside for a bit. It's not too cold, and the sky's clearing." Surprised, she took his hand. They pulled on jackets and boots, stepping into a pristine afternoon where clouds parted to reveal a gentle sun. Snow draped the trees in quiet majesty. They walked side by side along a makeshift path Stephen had packed down, talking in hushed tones about the future, her photography exhibitions, his uncertain role in the real estate world. At one point, Olivia paused, raising her camera to capture the way the sunlight transformed the snowy pines. She beamed at the shot, turning to Stephen. "Isn't it beautiful?" He nodded, eyes on her rather than the pines. "Yeah, it really is." Their gazes locked for a moment, the air charged with something unspoken. Then, as if a warning from nature, a stiff breeze cut across the clearing, ruffling Olivia's hair and chasing away the tender moment. They walked back to the cabin, each quietly acknowledging that whatever had begun here carried both a promise of healing and the risk of heartache. As they re-entered the warm glow of the living space, Stephen felt a whisper of hope. He realized that healing wasn't a solitary road. It sometimes required another person willing to walk part of the journey beside you. And while he wasn't sure what that meant for him and Olivia, the comfort of companionship in this lonely mountain refuge was a gift he found himself unwilling to dismiss. Several more days slipped by, each a step away from the dire isolation Stephen once felt. Gradually, the mountain's conditions improved. The snowplows cleared partial pathways near the main road, and mild spells of sunshine hinted that they might soon leave the cabin. A radio update from David Garrison confirmed that in another day or so, the route to Aspen could be passable, at least with a sturdy SUV. Though Olivia and Stephen welcomed the relief from the worst of winter's fury, they both sensed an undercurrent of apprehension. Each recognized this enclosed world they'd shared was about to change. The question lingered. Would they go their separate ways once the cabin's door opened to the wider world? Inside, the cabin's mood felt charged. Olivia often found Stephen gazing at her thoughtfully when he thought she wasn't looking. She, in turn, struggled with her own mixed emotions, needing to resume her travels, yet dreading the idea of saying goodbye to someone who had come to mean more than a mere stranger. One morning, Stephen awakened to sunlight streaming through a gap in the curtains. He rose from the armchair, where he dozed off reading a guidebook to Colorado's wildlife. The cabin felt warmer, the air no longer stinging his lungs when he inhaled. He found Olivia already up and about, zipping her jacket. "Going out?" he asked, his voice still heavy with sleep. She nodded, smiling. "I want to capture the morning light on those slopes behind the cabin." She patted her camera bag. "You're welcome to join me if you'd like." Something in her tone set his heart racing, an unspoken invitation that felt more significant than just a photo excursion. He grabbed his coat. "Sure, let me get my boots." They trudged through a narrow trail Stephen had cleared a few days earlier, the snow now a couple of feet lower than it had been at its peak. The trees glistened under the sun's gold rays. After walking for about 10 minutes, they reached a vantage point overlooking a small valley. The view was breathtaking, rolling hills of snow, dotted with tall evergreens that sparkled like crystals in the morning light. Olivia positioned her camera, snapping a series of shots. Stephen stood slightly behind her, taking in the panorama with a newfound appreciation. He thought about how she'd opened his eyes to the subtle beauty that winter could hold. As she clicked away, he realized that this experience, forced upon him by harsh circumstances, had become a strangely welcome turning point. Eventually, she lowered her camera, turning to meet his gaze. "I've never seen winter quite like this," she said softly. "It's brutal and beautiful at the same time." He nodded. "It's funny. I came here expecting only the brutality, but I've found moments of, I don't know, peace, maybe even wonder." Her cheeks flushed in the cold air, though he suspected there was another reason for the warmth in her face. She hesitated, then asked, "So what happens when the road's clear? Will you go back to Aspen?" He exhaled, watching his breath form a white cloud. "I probably should. I have a life there, obligations I've neglected. But I can't just return to the way things were. Everything's different now." She looked at him earnestly. "You'll figure it out. You're resourceful." "Maybe." He looked down at a patch of snow, scuffing it with his boot. "What about you?" Her gaze swept across the valley. "Once I'm back on my feet, I should head out again. I still have photography projects lined up. And I owe it to myself, and, well, my late friend, to keep pursuing what I love." A tension coiled in the space between them. He rubbed his gloved hands together, uncertain if he should voice the thought pressing at the edges of his mind. We could stay in touch. I could help you in Aspen, if there's anything you need." Her lips curved into a small, tentative smile. "I'd like that." Silence followed, neither quite sure how to navigate the intimacy of this moment. Eventually, Olivia hefted her camera bag, turning back toward the cabin. As they walked, Stephen felt the weight of unspoken possibilities crowd his thoughts. For the first time in years, he found himself wanting something beyond mere financial success. He wanted to be present, to care for someone, to share more than polite words. Back at the cabin, they settled by the fire to warm up. Stephen read a snippet from a local newspaper David had sent up, which mentioned road conditions. Says here a route to Aspen should be open tomorrow or the next day. She nodded, hugging her knees to her chest. So soon. He folded the paper, a knot in his stomach. Yeah, soon. He cleared his throat. Look, I'm grateful for this time we've had. It's changed me in ways I wasn't expecting. Olivia set her chin on her knees, her gaze intense. I feel the same. You reminded me that not all detours are disasters. He swallowed, tension flooding him. Part of him yearned to say something bolder, to see if this connection they'd built could survive outside the cabin walls. Yet he didn't know if the rawness of his grief or hers would allow it. In the hush that followed, neither found the right words. The fire snapped, sending tiny sparks dancing. Beyond the window, the sun shone brightly, heralding the end of their forced isolation. Each understood that the real test lay beyond this refuge, a test of whether they could confront their pasts, shape a future, and perhaps remain each other's ally even when the snow gave way to thawing roads and the looming responsibilities of the world outside. Morning sunlight filtered through the cabin's windows, casting long beams across the floor. Stephen stirred awake on the old armchair, blinking as he tried to recall what day it was. The storm-blurred calendar in his head told him it was close to a week since Olivia arrived at his doorstep. The rhythmic crackling of the fireplace had become a comforting constant, yet today there was a new energy in the air, an anticipation almost too intense to name. He rose and found Olivia by the kitchen counter, quietly pouring water into a pot. Her blonde hair caught the light, and she seemed more pensive than usual. Last night, David Garrison had radioed to confirm that a path to Aspen was passable, though not entirely clear. They could likely make the journey with four-wheel drive if they left soon. Morning, Stephen said softly, moving closer. You sleep okay? She glanced over her shoulder. As well as I could, thinking about what's next. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Right. Time to see if the roads are really open. A heavy silence stretched, filled by the soft clank of mugs and the hiss of water heating. Since David's message, both he and Olivia had avoided a direct conversation about leaving. He knew they couldn't stay forever, yet the thought of parting ways now felt strange, maybe even painful. They had found a fragile closeness here, one built under the pressure of snow-laden isolation. She set 2 mugs on the table. We'll try for Aspen after breakfast, right? Yeah, he agreed. We should. The SUV's got good traction, but if the main route is still half blocked, it might be slow going. She nodded. Better than staying put. I need to see if my car can be towed. And you, well, you have a life to sort out. He recognized the flicker of uncertainty in her tone. I do. I'm just not sure what that life looks like anymore. They ate breakfast in near silence, each lost in private thoughts. After they finished, Stephen methodically packed the few belongings he had scattered around, his journal, extra clothes, and Catherine's photograph. He glanced at Olivia, noticing she wrapped her camera in a protective case with unusual care. Outside, the air was brisk, but the sun glinted off the snow as if offering a fresh start. He loaded the SUV with supplies, ensuring they had blankets and emergency gear in case the roads turned nasty. Olivia checked the cabin one more time, making sure the fire was out and the generator turned off. The place already felt emptier, as though it was silently bidding them goodbye. They set off, the tires crunching through a thick layer of snow that had been partially ploughed. At first, the SUV lurched, struggling to find traction. Stephen's breath caught, heart pounding. Olivia cast him a worried look, but he forced a steady grip on the wheel. Gradually, the vehicle rumbled forward, forging a path through the fresh drifts. Tree branches, heavy with snow, hung over the road, occasionally brushing the SUV's roof with a soft scraping sound. After a mile or two, they reached the main route, more of a widened track than a proper road. Stephen slowed to navigate icy patches, the tension in his shoulders mounting. Olivia placed a hand on the dashboard to brace herself, but her eyes stayed firmly on the road ahead. "Let's hope we don't find any major obstructions," she said, her breath visible in the chilly air. He nodded, focusing on steering around fallen branches and ridges of ice. The scenery was starkly beautiful, a frozen landscape sparkling in midday light. Yet each passing minute reminded him they were inching closer to Aspen, to reality, to the responsibilities and sorrows he'd tried so hard to escape. He wondered if guilt would grip him again once he saw the city skyline, or if he'd face it with the steadiness he'd begun to cultivate. About an hour into the drive, they saw the first signs of civilization, a small service station and a scattering of homes. The road improved, the asphalt showing in patches. Olivia glanced at Stephen, eyes reflecting a mix of anticipation and apprehension. "So this is it," she murmured. "We're almost out." He pulled the SUV to a stop by the service station, shutting off the engine. "Let's see if they know anything about the route to Aspen, or your car." They stepped out into a sharper cold than at the cabin, perhaps because it came with the reminder of a complicated world waiting beyond. The service station looked deserted, but a single dim light burned inside. Olivia pounded on the door until a middle-aged man in a thick sweater peeked out. He confirmed that towing would be possible in a day or so, and Aspen was only about 15 more miles ahead. Stephen thanked him, feeling a strange pang of regret. Their time in the mountains was truly ending. When they returned to the SUV, he paused, resting a hand on the driver's door. "We'll sort out your car situation," he said, clearing his throat. "Then maybe we can figure out what to do next, together, or—" Olivia's expression was unreadable. She clasped her hands. "I'd like that, at least to know where you'll be. I have to find a place to stay in town, check in with my friend, but I still want to see you." He nodded, relief washing over him, though it was a small promise. It staved off the dread of abrupt separation. As he restarted the engine, Stephen felt a knot of tension and excitement churning in his chest. They were leaving the haven of the cabin behind, stepping into a new unknown, one laden with obligations, phone calls, and old ghosts. But at least, for now, they wouldn't have to face it all alone. They arrived in Aspen, under a brilliant afternoon sun. The city, though partially blanketed in white, bustled with activity. Snowplows rumbled, scraping the roads, while people in heavy coats and boots darted between shops. The stark contrast to the quiet mountain refuge left Stephen feeling overstimulated and oddly nostalgic for the stillness they had just abandoned. He found a parking spot near an upscale coffee shop downtown, the one he used to frequent for business meetings. Olivia gazed out the window, taking in the snow-capped buildings and twinkling holiday lights still hanging from the eaves. "This is more crowded than I expected," she remarked, fidgeting with her camera bag. "Peak season," Stephen replied, turning off the SUV's engine. "Ski tourists, corporate events. Aspen's always alive this time of year." She nodded, a subdued expression on her face. He sensed her unease, perhaps from the stark shift back into civilization after the intimate days in the cabin. He, too, felt unsettled. The phone he'd barely touched while away now buzzed with notifications every few seconds, a reminder of the life he'd set aside. They stepped onto the sidewalk, breath puffing in the crisp air. Everything felt too bright, too busy. Olivia clung to her bag, eyeing the passing crowd. "Let's see if there's a tow company or mechanic around here. I should at least arrange for my car." He agreed, and they walked toward a small plaza. Stephen's chest constricted as they passed the sleek tower of offices where he used to work. He glanced at the glass facade, memories flooding him, late nights, frantic deals, phone calls with Catherine he'd cut short. A wave of sorrow washed over him. "You okay?" Olivia asked quietly. Noticing his sudden pause, he forced a nod, clearing his throat. "Yeah, just remembering things." He gestured to the building. "I had an office on the 13th floor. Spent most of my life in there, I guess." She squeezed his hand gently, then let go as someone brushed past them. Together, they found a small mechanic's shop. The receptionist, a woman wearing a thick flannel shirt, agreed to dispatch a tow truck if the roads to the cabin area were clear enough. Olivia gave the approximate location of her car. The receptionist typed rapidly into an old computer, then promised to call or text with updates. As they stepped back onto the street, Olivia's phone finally found a signal, buzzing with missed messages. She scanned them, lips pursing. "My friend, Mason, has been trying to reach me for days. He's the one who was expecting me in Aspen. Might be best if I go see him, figure out lodging for the night." Stephen felt a twisting in his gut, a faint anxiety at the thought of her vanishing into the city. "Of course. I can drop you off wherever you need." She glanced up, offering a reassuring smile. "Thank you, and after I talk to him, maybe we can meet for dinner. I'd like to keep talking about everything." He realized how important that was, the chance to maintain some continuity between their time at the cabin and the chaotic reality here. "Definitely. Let me know where and when, and I'll be there." They navigated the streets until Olivia found her friend's address, a cozy lodge on the quieter side of Aspen. She hopped out, clutching her camera bag and a small suitcase Stephen had carried for her. "I'll text you, okay?" He nodded, feeling her absence the moment she closed the SUV door. Watching her walk up the porch steps, he experienced a pang that was oddly like loss. Shaking it off, he drove back toward the heart of town, phone buzzing constantly. Finally, he pulled over and braced himself for what he might see in his messages. Voicemails and texts from Peter, from the board members, from worried employees. Though he dreaded it, he listened to a voicemail from Peter first. "Stephen," came Peter's tense voice. "Where the hell are you? Investors are on edge. We rescheduled important talks 3 times. The board wants answers. Call me as soon as you get this." Exhaling, Stephen mustered the courage to respond. After a few rings, Peter's exasperated tone sounded, "You finally came out of hiding." "Peter," he said, weariness creeping into his voice. "I'm back in Aspen. I had an emergency. Personal reasons." The line went quiet a moment. Then Peter huffed. "I've been defending you, telling everyone to cut you slack because of your sister's passing. But we can't stall forever." A part of Stephen wanted to lash out, to remind Peter that Catherine had been more than just an excuse for tardiness. Yet he took a measured breath. "I appreciate it. Listen, I'm not sure I'm ready to jump back into things the way they were. My perspective has changed." Peter paused, sounding uncertain. "Then come to the office, meet the board and explain. Otherwise, they might move on from you, Stephen." The possibility didn't scare him as much as it once did. "Fine," he said, nodding to himself. "I'll be there tomorrow." He hung up, chest tight with conflicting emotions. Anger, guilt, and an odd sense of liberation. Leaning back in the driver's seat, he glanced out the window at the bustling sidewalk. In the reflection, he hardly recognized himself. Days ago, he was determined to remain a recluse, punishing himself for Catherine's death. Now he was back in the middle of the very world he'd fled, with new feelings and new bonds stirring in his heart. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, he texted Olivia, "Meeting with my old partners tomorrow. Let's have dinner tonight if you can. I need a friendly face." Part of him feared she'd be swept away by her friend or her own plans, but some deeper sense told him she wouldn't ignore his message. He decided to drive to his penthouse, unused for weeks, a shrine to his old life. What awaited him there, he couldn't say, but he felt a faint surge of courage in knowing that at least he wasn't facing it all alone anymore. Stephen's penthouse felt uncomfortably pristine when he arrived. Dust motes danced in the late afternoon light, but otherwise every polished surface gleamed as if trapped in time. The refrigerator hummed quietly, and the massive windows overlooked the city's rooftops. He'd once been proud of this view, a testament to his success, but now it evoked a bitter-sweet ache. He wandered through the rooms, dropping his bag in the hallway. Catherine's photograph was still tucked inside it, a constant reminder of why he'd left in the first place. The emptiness amplified the tension in his thoughts. Tomorrow, he'd face the board to explain himself or risk being pushed out. He called out to the silence, half expecting a reply that never came. Eventually, he stepped into the living room, noticing an envelope propped against a decorative vase. His name was scrawled on it in Peter's handwriting. With cautious curiosity, Stephen opened it to find a letter detailing the board's concerns, missed deadlines, lost deals, the imperative that he attend a meeting promptly. Peter had added a handwritten note. "You can still fix this, if you want to." Anxiety surged, along with the impulse to toss the letter in the trash, yet he knew he couldn't hide. Catherine's death had taught him that turning away from problems didn't solve them. He folded the paper and set it aside, willing himself to accept that tomorrow's confrontation was inevitable. A soft chime on his phone announced a text from Olivia. "Sure, dinner, 7 p.m. at that place near Main Street. Mason recommended it. See you soon." A sense of relief flooded him. Whatever else happened, he wouldn't have to face the evening alone. He quickly showered, scrubbing off layers of mountain grit and the lingering chill from the cabin. The warm water felt like a partial return to a world he'd almost forgotten, luxurious but strangely hollow. Dressing in casual clothes, he stared at himself in the bathroom mirror. The reflection showed tired eyes, a faint stubble on his jaw, and a tentative determination he hadn't seen in himself before. "I can do this," he told his reflection, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. An hour later, he was seated in a modest bistro on Main Street, different from the high-end places he once frequented with business associates. Candlelight flickered on each table, illuminating walls adorned with local artwork. Soft jazz played in the background. Stephen felt his pulse quicken when Olivia entered, wearing a simple sweater, her hair loosely tied back. She spotted him, relief evident in her eyes. "Hey," he greeted, rising to pull out her chair. "Thanks," she said, settling down with a smile. "I'm glad we're doing this. Mason wanted me to hang out at the lodge tonight, but I couldn't leave you alone." Her openness surprised him, and he realized how supportive she'd become in such a short time. "I appreciate it," he paused, searching her face. "How's Mason? Is he upset you disappeared?" She exhaled. He was worried. "But now that he knows I'm safe, he's mostly curious how I ended up with you in a cabin." "I might have left out some details for now." A ghost of a grin played on Stephen's lips. "Probably best. The story's a bit intense." They ordered simple meals. She picked a house salad with grilled salmon, while he chose roasted chicken and vegetables. The server poured them glasses of water, and they sat with a comfortable hush lingering between them. Eventually, Olivia broke the silence. "How does it feel being back in your penthouse?" He let out a slow breath. "Empty." My old life is still there, but it feels foreign. I guess I changed more than I realized. He toyed with his napkin, thinking of the letter from Peter. Tomorrow, I have to meet the board. They'll want me to swear I'm the same driven businessman I was. I'm not sure I can do that. Her gaze held understanding. What do you want? The directness of her question gave him pause. He thought back to the nights by the cabin's fireplace, the flicker of Catherine's photograph, the deep ache in his heart. I used to want power, success, money. I chased it all, and look where it got me. He shook his head. Now, I think I want something else, maybe a sense of purpose, to stop feeling like Catherine's death was in vain. She reached across the table, her fingertips brushing his hand in a gesture of quiet support. That's worth pursuing, even if it means leaving some people behind, or letting them leave you. He nodded, feeling the restaurant's warmth close in on them like a gentle cocoon. In that moment, he found a measure of resolve. He could still be involved in real estate, but not in the same relentless way. If he stayed, it would be on his terms, reshaping the company around values he'd neglected. They ate in companionable silence, the bond between them growing more tangible. By the time dessert arrived, shared slices of homemade pie, Stephen felt an unfamiliar sense of calm. Tomorrow's challenge loomed, but at least he had clarity, and he had someone by his side who understood, even if only for a short while. After paying the bill, he walked Olivia back to her lodge. Snow crunched beneath their feet, the night sky clear and star-speckled. As they stood by the entrance, a hush fell, broken only by the distant hum of cars. She looked up at him. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said softly, "remember you're not alone in this. Call me if it gets tough." His heart clenched with gratitude. "I will." He leaned in, pressing a light, tentative kiss to her cheek. She smiled, a flicker of warmth in her eyes, and then she disappeared behind the lodge's door, leaving him with a lingering sense of hope that maybe, just maybe, he was on the cusp of something better than he ever imagined. The morning dawned cold and bright, a slight haze drifting over aspen slopes. Stephen stood in front of his penthouse mirror, straightening a charcoal grey blazer. He noticed his reflection looked different from the version of himself who'd once thrived on boardroom drama. Today, his shoulders felt tense but determined. He thought of Catherine and mouthed a silent plea for courage. Traffic was light as he drove to the high-rise that housed the offices of his real estate company. Sunshine glinted off the building's mirrored exterior, reminding him of how he'd once relished seeing his own reflection in those windows, a symbol of accomplishment. Now, walking through the sleek lobby, he felt a twist of nostalgia and anxiety. Security staff greeted him politely, and he rode the elevator to the 13th floor, lost in memories of deals closed and expansions planned. Peter met him at the reception area. With his trim suit and urgent posture, Peter looked every bit the pragmatic businessman Stephen remembered. His face lit with relief when he saw Stephen. "You came," he said, offering a brisk handshake. "Thank God. They're all in the conference room." Stephen nodded. "Let's not keep them waiting." They walked down a corridor lined with framed press clippings, announcements of major acquisitions, philanthropic galas, and pictures of Stephen standing beside city officials. Each reminded him of a life that felt increasingly distant. Inside the conference room, half a dozen board members sat around a long table. Their eyes flicked to Stephen the moment he entered. He recognized them all. Barbara, a finance veteran with a keen eye for balance sheets. Malik, an industry disruptor always hungry for new investments. Fiona, an older executive who had known him since his early 20s. And a few others. Each wore a guarded expression. "Stephen," Barbara began, her voice measured. "Good to see you. We've been concerned about your absence." Malik grunted an acknowledgement. "We've lost time and money in your absence. The TriStar project is stalled, for one. Stephen took a seat at the head of the table. Peter positioned himself beside him, arms folded defensively. "I understand everyone's frustration," Stephen said, keeping his voice steady. "I lost my sister recently. It hit me harder than I expected. I had to step away." Fiona leaned forward, her gaze gentler. "Our condolences, Stephen. We tried to give you room to grieve, but we've got obligations to shareholders, partners, and staff. We need clarity moving forward." A hush followed, broken only by the soft hum of the overhead lighting. Stephen inhaled, reminding himself that fear wouldn't help him now. "I'm back to address those obligations, but I won't pretend everything is the same. I've changed, and I believe the company needs to change too." A ripple of reaction circled the table. Malik narrowed his eyes. "In what sense?" Stephen met his gaze. "We've been driven by profit alone, pushing aggressive expansions, sometimes at the expense of community impact. We can do better. We have the resources to make housing more affordable in parts of the city, or partner with local charities to ensure ethically sustainable development. That's the direction I want." Barbara tapped a pen on her notepad, a slight frown marring her usually composed features. "That might not sit well with some investors who expect high returns." Stephen forced a calm tone. "I'm aware. But if we keep chasing only short-term gains, we'll undermine our integrity. We've made enough profit to balance both. It's about leadership priorities." The board members exchanged glances. Some looked intrigued, others remained skeptical. Peter chimed in, trying to mediate. "Stephen's been the driving force behind our success. We can adapt without losing our edge. Corporate social responsibility can attract a different kind of investor, especially here in Aspen, where there's a lot of emphasis on community well-being." Fiona sighed, rubbing her temples. "We need a strategic plan, numbers, timelines, a coherent pitch. Investors will want specifics." Stephen nodded, adrenaline coursing through him. "I'll gather details and present a revised business plan in a week. We can realign some projects and explore new partnerships. If you'll give me that chance, I'll prove it can be done." Malik drummed his fingers on the table. "And if we say no..." The question hung in the air, taut with significance. Stephen drew a breath. "Then I'll resign. Sell my shares to whoever wants them. I'm not going back to the old methods that cost me everything important." A hush fell, the board staring at him in surprise. Peter swallowed, clearly caught off guard by the ultimatum. After a moment, Barbara spoke, her voice quieter. "That's a serious proposition." Stephen nodded, letting them see his resolve. He knew the risk. If they rejected his plan, he'd be cut loose from the empire he'd built. Yet he felt more certain than ever that continuing the old way was impossible. Catherine's memory spurred him on, reminding him that life was too precious to waste on hollow pursuits. Fiona turned to the others. "I propose we let Stephen present his new direction with a detailed plan. Then we decide." The board murmured agreement, and Stephen's heartbeat slowed in cautious relief. He promised to deliver the details soon, then rose to leave. Peter followed him out, looking both concerned and impressed. "That was bold," Peter said, once they were alone in the hallway. "It needed to be," Stephen replied, still reeling from the confrontation. "I'm done chasing empty trophies. If I stay, it's to make a real difference." Peter stared at him, then gave a nod. "I hope you pull it off. For everyone's sake." By late afternoon, the tension of the board meeting clung to Stephen like a heavy cloak. Still, he walked away feeling more certain of his path. It was a risky compromise. Try to reshape the company or walk away for good. Yet the weight in his chest felt lighter than it had in months. After leaving the office, he sat in his SUV, scribbling notes for the new plan on a yellow legal pad. Ideas flowed about affordable housing initiatives, possible collaborations with local non-profits, and ways to incorporate eco-friendly design. He envisioned Catherine's encouraging smile, urging him on. Even if the board ultimately rejected him, he was ready to stand by his convictions. His phone buzzed, a message from Olivia. "How did it go? Are you all right?" A warmth spread through him at her concern. "It went better than expected," he replied. "I have a chance to make changes here. Meeting you at your lodge soon." Her response came quickly. "Yes, please. I'd love to hear the details." He pulled away from the building, weaving through Aspen streets until he reached the cozy lodge where Olivia was staying. She was waiting outside, wearing a puffy jacket that almost swallowed her petite frame, a bright smile peeking through her scarf. The moment he parked, she hurried over, her boots crunching on the snow. "You did it," she said, sliding into the passenger seat and closing the door behind her. "You look more alive than I've seen you before." He grinned, a mix of nerves and excitement. "They didn't outright reject me." "That's more than I hoped for." She pulled off her scarf, eyes bright with relief. "So they're giving you time to propose a new direction?" He nodded. "Yes. I have to prove it's viable. If it's not, they'll likely push me out. But I'm ready to take that chance." Her hand found his, the closeness in the SUV a reminder of the intimacy they'd shared in the cabin. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. They both realized the weight of that statement. In such a short time, they'd formed a bond forged by snowstorms and confessions of grief, yet each was aware that life would soon pull them along different paths. Hesitant, Stephen suggested they drive somewhere quieter to talk. Olivia agreed, and within minutes they'd left the busy streets behind, heading up a winding road that overlooked Aspen's valley. They found a small, scenic overlook, where a cleared parking area gave them a broad view of the city below. The sun was dipping behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and lavender. Sitting with the engine off, windows slightly lowered, they let the crisp air mingle with the warmth inside. "How do you feel?" she asked softly, shifting to face him. He considered, a little scared, but also hopeful. "It's like I'm finally allowed to live in a way that doesn't revolve around guilt." Her gaze flickered with compassion. "And your sister? Does it still hurt as much?" He clenched his jaw, thinking about Catherine's photograph in his pocket. "It does, but it feels different now, like I can honor her by doing something good, something that reflects who she was." He hesitated, swallowing hard. "And what about you? What's next for Olivia Parker?" She wrapped her arms around herself. "Mason's hooking me up with a small exhibit here in Aspen, so I'll be busy editing photos and planning the display. After that, I might travel again. There's a lead on a wildlife photography job in Montana." Her eyes flickered down to her hands. "But I'm not sure if I want to roam like I used to. Losing my friend taught me that sometimes we run instead of building real connections." Stephen's heart thudded as he heard the unspoken question in her words. He reached out, gently brushing her fingers. "Maybe you don't have to run," he offered. "Or you can roam in a different way, one that includes letting people in." She exhaled shakily. "Yes, that sounds nice." A faint smile curved her lips. "You've helped me see that I don't have to do everything alone." They watched the sun sink lower, the city lights flickering on in the valley, turning Aspen into a constellation of golden glimmers. The hush between them spoke volumes. Then, with a rush of courage, Stephen spoke. "Look, I don't know where all this leads, my new direction, your photography, or this connection between us, but I don't want to lose it. I don't want to lose you." Her eyes shone, and she leaned closer. "I don't want to lose you either," she whispered. He kissed her then, a gentle, tentative meeting of lips that carried the weight of sorrow, hope, and a promise for something beyond the mistakes they'd both made. In that embrace, it felt as though the lingering guilt and regrets had found a path toward release, replaced by the possibility of a shared future, even if they didn't yet know its shape. When they finally parted, breath mingling in the cold air, Olivia rested her forehead against his. "Where do we go from here?" she asked, her voice hushed. Stephen let out a tremulous laugh. "I guess we climb on step by step. We have families to call, projects to fix, a million things to handle, but maybe we do it together, or at least without shutting each other out." She nodded, a softness lighting her expression. As twilight claimed the sky, they lingered in the stillness, warmed by each other's company, resolved to face the challenges waiting below, knowing they had both come a long way from the storms that first brought them together. Stephen Reed stood on the balcony of his penthouse, gazing at Aspen's cityscape as the first hint of dawn lit the horizon. A chill breeze drifted up from the streets below, reminding him of the winter storms he had weathered in that remote mountain cabin. These days, the cold felt less like a punishment and more like an awakening. He sipped his coffee, realizing how different he felt from the man who once saw this city only as a testament to his real estate empire. Inside, the penthouse's minimalist furnishings still gleamed under recessed lighting, but everything seemed to have shifted in his eyes. The large, polished dining table felt oddly impersonal. He could still recall the small wooden table in the cabin where he and Olivia huddled, sharing meals by lantern light. That memory tugged at him. She was still in town, preparing for her photography exhibition, and he found himself glancing at his phone often, half expecting her to text a new discovery or idea. He turned at the sound of quiet footsteps. His mother, Elizabeth Reed, had arrived in Aspen the previous night, determined to see him. She entered the living room, wearing a modest wool coat and carrying a worn leather handbag. Though her hair was grayer now, she stood with a certain poise, eyes sharp and worried. "Good morning," Stephen greeted, motioning for her to join him. She cast a wary look around the penthouse. "I was afraid you'd still be hiding up in the mountains." He managed a faint smile. "I almost stayed, but it was time to come back." Elizabeth exhaled, her posture relaxing. "I wanted to visit after Catherine's funeral, but you vanished." "I didn't know how to reach you." Stephen's gaze dropped, guilt nudging him again. "I'm sorry, I needed time to think and to feel." Her eyes softened. "You were always so driven. I suppose I thought you'd bury yourself in work rather than isolate, but I understand needing space." They moved inside, sitting across from each other in the living room. Elizabeth studied him closely, as if searching for signs of the old Stephen she knew. "Your father wanted to come, but he's been dealing with his own grief. He's not sure how to talk about Catherine without breaking down." Stephen's throat constricted. "I can't blame him. This whole thing—" He paused, remembering the final call he never answered. "I've blamed myself for a long time, still do some days." Elizabeth reached out, resting her hand lightly on his arm. "Losing a child is an unimaginable pain. But your father and I never wanted you to shoulder all the guilt. Catherine's accident—" She hesitated, a flicker of sadness crossing her face. "It happened because life can be cruel, not because you're a bad brother." The sincerity in her voice pressed tears to the corners of his eyes. He looked away, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I wish I could have saved her." She patted his arm gently. "We all do." After a moment's hush, she forced a small smile. "What are your plans now that you're back? The business? Your personal life?" He took a breath, sorting through the swirl of ideas. "I'm still leading the company for now, but I'm changing our direction, focusing on more ethical projects. As for my personal life, He stopped, realizing it felt good to share. I met someone, Olivia Parker. She's a photographer, and she was stranded in the same storm I was. We rode it out together in the cabin. Elizabeth's eyes widened in surprise, a ghost of relief flickering across her features. She must be quite remarkable to have caught your attention in the midst of all that. She is, he said softly. She's strong, creative, and she understands loss in her own way. We're taking things slow, but it feels promising. Elizabeth smiled, a genuine warmth. I'd like to meet her if she'll have me. Stephen nodded, an unexpected wave of gratitude filling him. He felt a sudden closeness to his mother that he hadn't felt in years, a sense that maybe their family could heal. I'd like that too. They spent the next hour talking in hushed tones, reminiscing about Catherine, her sense of humor, her love of nature, the time she convinced Stephen to try rock climbing despite his fear of heights. Each story felt like a small step toward honoring her memory without drowning in regret. When Elizabeth finally rose to leave, she held him in a long embrace, murmuring that she was proud of him. Alone again, Stephen wandered to his office, rummaging through papers about the upcoming presentation he'd give to the board. The desk's surface was cluttered with notes about affordable housing projects and community outreach. Each line of planning felt like a promise to himself, and perhaps to Catherine, that he'd use his resources for something meaningful. His phone buzzed, a message from Olivia, working on the exhibit, having trouble picking which photos to display. Think you can come by later? He smiled, typing a quick reply of reassurance. Glancing around the penthouse once more, he felt a gentle confidence welling within him. There were still difficult roads ahead, but at least now he sensed a renewed purpose in everything he did, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't afraid to embrace it fully. A brisk afternoon wind blew across Aspen sidewalks as Stephen stepped out of his SUV in front of the Pine Gallery, a modest art space on a tree-lined street. A painted wooden sign hung above the entrance, advertising local artists and photographers. Stephen paused outside, noticing the large windows that revealed glimpses of framed prints inside. Beyond the glass, he could see Olivia Parker adjusting a display, her expression intent. He'd never expected to spend his free time in a gallery like this, but the life he once knew had been flipped on its head. Balancing corporate responsibilities and personal growth proved challenging, yet the draw of Olivia's company gave him a sense of stability he couldn't find anywhere else. Inside, the gallery smelled of fresh paint and sawdust. A few workers moved around, hanging pictures on the wall. Olivia glanced over her shoulder, spotted him, and waved with a smile. The tension in his chest eased. "Hey," she said, stepping away from a photograph of snowy pines. "You made it." He took in the sight of her, cheeks slightly flushed from exertion, hair loosely pulled back, and that familiar spark of determination in her blue eyes. "Couldn't miss it. I see you're setting up the exhibit." She nodded, gesturing to a row of photographs leaning against the wall. "Mason and I decided to showcase some of my nature shots, but I'm torn on which ones should be the highlights." Stephen approached a cluster of prints. One captured a lone deer in a snowy clearing, the image so crisp it seemed alive. Another displayed a panoramic of Colorado mountains at sunrise, bathed in purples and golds. He recognized the presence of her heart in each frame. "They're stunning. I'd say pick the ones that mean the most to you personally." Olivia toyed with a small level in her hand. "That's the problem. I love them all in different ways." Each shot has a memory attached. He remembered the day she arrived, half frozen at the cabin door, and how every day since had carried a memory of its own. Maybe focus on what you want to share about your journey. Sometimes the meaning behind the photo matters more than technical perfection. She glanced up at him, gratitude shimmering in her eyes. I appreciate your perspective. You've changed so much since I first met you. He gave a rueful smile. Being snowbound with a talented photographer has that effect, especially when she challenges you to rethink everything. A soft laugh escaped her. We challenged each other, I think. She placed a hand lightly on his arm, then cleared her throat. How's work? Did you present anything new to the board yet? He sighed. I'm still refining the business model. I have another meeting in 2 days. The numbers show we can invest in community projects without sinking profits, but some board members remain skeptical. He paused, drawing courage from Olivia's gaze. I won't back down. If they push me out, so be it. She leaned closer, voice low. I believe you'll make it work. Your passion is evident. Before he could respond, Mason, a tall man with curly brown hair, stepped over. He wore paint-splattered jeans and carried a roll of tape. Olivia, we need your input on how to arrange the back wall. Oh, hi there, he added, nodding to Stephen. Stephen nodded politely in return, seeing how comfortable Mason seemed with Olivia, as though they'd known each other for years. He felt a small sting of jealousy before reminding himself they were just friends. I'm Stephen. Nice to meet you. Mason, the man answered, turning to pat Olivia's shoulder. Don't let me interrupt. Just letting you know the frames are ready. Olivia acknowledged him with a smile, then gestured towards Stephen. He can help me decide. He's got a good eye for what resonates. A spark of pride lit Stephen's chest, but also a touch of nerves. He'd never been called on for creative input like this, yet in the past weeks he'd discovered a side of himself that appreciated the natural world in a profound way. I'll do my best, he said, following them to the back of the gallery. They spent the next hour positioning prints, adjusting lighting, and discussing the stories behind each photo. Stephen found himself lost in Olivia's passion for capturing fleeting moments. The rustle of deer in the brush, the warm glow of a mountain sunrise, the way ice crystals formed around tree branches. Through her descriptions, he sensed a desire to share beauty as a form of healing, for herself, for others, maybe even for him. By the time they finished, the gallery looked transformed. A hush fell, broken only by the hum of distant traffic and the faint whir of a heater. Olivia leaned against a wall, exhaustion and contentment visible in her posture. Mason excused himself to finalize some paperwork at the front desk. Stephen looked at her, his voice quiet. This is incredible. Every shot feels alive. She gave a soft smile, eyes reflecting a trace of vulnerability. Thank you. It's been a while since I let anyone in on the deeper meaning behind my work, but it feels right here. He took her hand gently. Let's keep doing what feels right, then, for both of us. Her fingers squeezed his. A silent affirmation. In that moment, the gallery's bright lights and art-lined walls felt like an extension of the cabin's intimacy, a place where two wounded souls could meet, share their journeys, and perhaps begin to heal together. A crisp sunrise bathed Aspen's snow-dusted rooftops in pale gold. As Stephen drove toward the company's offices, the board meeting loomed, and despite the nerves fluttering in his chest, he felt a strange undercurrent of confidence. The revised business plan rested on a USB drive in his pocket, along with several printed copies. Months ago, he would have prepared with corporate jargon and bulletproof spreadsheets. Today, he also carried a sense of moral purpose that came from somewhere deeper than the bottom line. He parked and entered the familiar lobby, passing the front desk where employees glanced at him with curiosity. A hush seemed to follow him into the elevator. Reaching the 13th floor, he found Peter waiting outside the conference room, studying his phone with a furrowed brow. The moment Peter saw him, he exhaled in relief. "They're all in there," Peter said. Do you have what you need? Stephen patted his coat pocket. Everything. Inside, the board members murmured among themselves, flipping through initial notes he'd emailed the day before. Stephen sat at the head of the table, hooking up his laptop to the projector. The screen flickered, revealing the title of his presentation, Reimagining Our Role, Community, Sustainability, and Growth. He saw slight raises of eyebrows around the room, some intrigued, some skeptical. Clearing his throat, Stephen began. He spoke about the financial feasibility of rebalancing the company's portfolio to include affordable housing developments, green building techniques, and local partnerships with non-profits. He demonstrated, through charts and graphs, that these projects could yield solid returns over time while enriching the community. He acknowledged concerns about short-term profits, but emphasized long-term resilience and positive brand reputation. As he concluded, a hush fell. Barbara, the finance veteran, pressed her lips together thoughtfully. Malik tapped a pen against the table, glancing between the numbers on the slides and the stack of printed materials. Fiona, arms folded, studied him with careful attention. Finally, Fiona asked, "Stephen, do you truly believe this is the future of the company? Or is this just a short-term pivot because of your personal loss?" Stephen met her gaze, reminding himself of Catherine's last voicemail, the one he never answered. His voice steadied. "It's not just about grief. My sister's death forced me to see that success without meaning is empty. Our firm can do more than flip properties for profit. We can build something lasting, something honorable." Malik cleared his throat. "We'd need to phase existing contracts carefully. Investors might balk at new directions. How do we handle pushback?" Stephen advanced to a slide detailing gradual implementation, investor outreach, and marketing strategies that highlighted the positive public relations of socially responsible development. "We can position ourselves as leaders in sustainable, community-oriented real estate, which is a growing sector. Some investors will resist, but will attract others who value these principles." Barbara leaned forward. "The numbers show it's possible, though not guaranteed. It's a bold risk." He allowed a slight smile. "Yes, it is. But continuing without purpose is a different kind of risk, one to our integrity." A few minutes passed as the board members asked questions, flipping through data. Peter occasionally chimed in, defending the plan's logic. Tension thickened, but Stephen sensed he wasn't facing outright rejection. He recalled nights in the cabin, staring at the flickering fire, wondering if he'd ever find a way to honor Catherine's memory. Now, looking around at these seasoned executives, he felt a cautious surge of hope. Fiona finally spoke again, softer this time. "I think we can vote on adopting this strategic shift for a trial period. Stephen, you'll lead it, with quarterly reports to gauge progress." Malik gave a short nod. "I'm willing to see where this goes." Barbara pursed her lips. "Let's take it to a vote." One by one, the board members raised their hands in favor. Relief flooded Stephen as the majority approved. Although not all seemed enthusiastic, there was enough support to move forward. He fought the urge to grin, remembering the times he'd left Catherine's calls to voicemail. Now, in this boardroom, he felt her presence, as though she were whispering a soft affirmation that he was finally listening, to her ideals, to his conscience. When the meeting adjourned, the tension dissipated into a hum of new possibilities. The board members dispersed, some offering curt nods of respect, others simply hustling out with their briefcases. Peter clapped Stephen's shoulder, murmuring, "You did it." Stephen nodded, shaking hands with those who lingered. Alone in the conference room, he sank into a chair, letting the weight of relief settle over him. In his pocket, his phone vibrated. A message from Olivia. "Good luck today. I believe in you." He smiled. typing back, "We got approval. Let's celebrate later." Pocketing his phone, he rose and gazed at the blank screen of the projector. This was just the first step, a shared legacy in the making, one that would blend his business acumen with the empathy he'd been too blind to embrace before. That evening, the Pine Gallery buzzed with energy for Olivia's exhibit. Soft jazz music played from hidden speakers, while a modest crowd mingled, sipping wine and studying the photographs adorning the walls. Through the large windows, twinkling city lights cast reflections on the gallery floor, creating a sense of intimacy and warmth. Stephen arrived a bit late, having stayed at the office to finalize some paperwork for the newly approved projects. Now he stepped inside, scanning for Olivia. He spotted her near the center of the room, laughing with Mason and another friend. She wore a knee-length black dress that accentuated her easy grace. The moment she saw him, her grin widened, and she excused herself, weaving through the visitors. "I'm so glad you could make it," she said, a soft flush creeping to her cheeks. He took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I wouldn't miss it. How's it going?" She swept a glance around the exhibit space, eyes shining with excitement. "Better than I expected. People seem moved by the photographs. And a few have even asked about purchasing prints." He smiled, leaning closer. "That's fantastic. You deserve every success." They moved together to examine one of her featured shots, a sweeping landscape of the mountainous area near the cabin. Pale sunlight hit the snowy hills, and a single pine stood in the foreground, bent slightly as though bowing to the winter wind. Beside it hung a smaller print of a half-buried road, footprints trailing into the distance. "That's the path leading to your cabin," Olivia murmured, brushing her fingertips over the frame. "I took it on one of those mornings when the sky cleared just enough for me to walk around outside." He remembered that day vividly, the hush of the snow, the shared thermos of tea afterward. It's powerful. It shows how isolation can also hold a quiet kind of beauty. A couple approached, curious about the pieces. Olivia turned with a ready smile, explaining her creative process and the emotional journey behind each photograph. Stephen listened, both proud and humbled by her willingness to share her vulnerability with strangers. When the couple left, Mason appeared, giving Stephen a playful nudge. "So you're the mystery cabin guy, huh? Olivia's told me bits and pieces. Glad to finally meet you properly." Stephen felt a warm flush. "Likewise." "Thanks for supporting her exhibit," Mason nodded. "She's got real talent, always has. This show could lead to bigger ones, maybe even national galleries if the buzz keeps growing." He grinned at Olivia, who rolled her eyes at his enthusiasm. "Anyway, I'll let you two enjoy the night." After Mason strolled off, Stephen and Olivia lingered near another photograph. A close-up of frost patterns on a cabin window, capturing delicate swirls of ice crystals. The label beneath simply read, "In the midst of silence." He couldn't help but reflect on how that silence once felt suffocating, but now stood as a marker of transformation. They drifted through the gallery, exchanging small talk with art enthusiasts and local photographers. The sense of community was palpable, an appreciation for creativity and resilience. Eventually, they found a quieter corner near a table of refreshments. Stephen poured them each a glass of sparkling cider, and they toasted under the gentle lighting. "To new beginnings," he said, meeting her gaze. "To facing our ghosts," she added, her expression turning serious, "and finding something worth living for in the process." They sipped their drinks, letting the music and conversation wash over them. In the lull, she touched his arm. "How did things go at the office? You mentioned good news." He grinned. "The board approved my plan, tentatively, at least. We're moving forward with more community-focused projects. It felt right." A flicker of relief and pride lit her features. "Catherine would be proud. I'm sure of it." He felt his throat tighten. I think so, he managed, voice low. I hope so. They stood in companionable silence, the swirl of gallery patrons passing by. He understood this moment as a quiet affirmation. The grief that once paralyzed him had turned into a driving force for change. Olivia, too, had found a way to transform her sorrow into art that spoke to others. Neither of them had been fully healed, but they were living again, creating new memories, forging new paths. After the exhibit started winding down, they stepped outside for a breath of crisp winter air. The streets glowed with string lights. Music from a nearby cafe drifted through the night. Without speaking, they strolled along the sidewalk, hands clasped. Snow lay in gentle drifts along the curbs, reflecting the moonlight. At the corner of the block, Stephen paused, turning to face Olivia. A blend of gratitude and tenderness welled up inside him. "Thank you," he whispered, "for knocking on my door that night." She smiled, eyes shining, and squeezed his hand. "I guess we both needed a little push from fate." As the city lights shimmered around them, they continued walking, guided by an unspoken understanding that while life remained imperfect and unpredictable, they had chosen to move forward together. And in that choice, they found a quiet resolution, stepping into a future shaped not by regret, but by hope and the promise of better days ahead. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.